Check, 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 check.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like you to take your seats so we can get started. We have a full morning together today. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. This is a new center that is working both in Durham and here in Washington, D.C. on applied health policy issues, frequently in collaboration with government agencies and others. So we're very pleased to be here today on a collaborative topic, building a common REMS platform. We're happy to have you with us today. There are also a number of people who are joining us online. We'd like to welcome you all as well. This conference is being convened, as I mentioned, by the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy in collaboration with the FDA, and we're very much looking forward to working with you today and on many other topics going forward. Today, this important topic on a common REMS platform is one that many of you have struggled with for some time, encouraging access to safe use of drugs with risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, or REMS, but making sure that we have efficient and effective access at the same time. With passage of the Food and Drug Administration Acts of 2007, the FDA was given authority to require sponsors to develop these risk evaluation and mitigation strategy programs, or REMS programs, for drugs and biologics that carry serious potential or known risks. And since its implementation, the REMS program has become an important activity with the goal of ensuring that the benefits of a given medical product outweigh its associated with risks and use, enabling the agency to approve a number of products that might not otherwise have been made available for patient use. While it has served an important function, concerns have been raised regarding the effectiveness of REMS tools, their impact on patient access to products, and the associated burden on providers and on healthcare systems. While challenges exist, this has been an area of a lot of attention, some attention in further user fee legislation, some attention from the clinical and patient communities, and a lot of attention from FDA related to projects to standardize and better integrate REMS programs into our increasingly electronic healthcare system. The agency's most recent initiative is the Common REMS Platform, which was unveiled at an FDA public workshop last year. And we're going to hear more about this initiative in just a little bit, but I think it's important to know that this platform is not a new piece of software. It's not a centralized database. Rather, the Common REMS Platform is a set of data standards, ones that's intended to promote interoperability and efficiency in the choice and use of medications that carry known or potential risk. It will be a set of data standards acknowledged and maintained by the FDA to facilitate information exchange and implementation of REMS. There are many opportunities for how REMS programs could be further integrated into the increasingly electronic daily operations in healthcare, and we're looking forward to hearing from all of you today on what these opportunities might look like. This is a very important area of public policy, not only to promote more effective use and more efficient use of REMS, but also as a potential additional source of momentum for electronic systems that actually work well to make the lives of patients and healthcare providers more efficient and to promote more safe and effective use of medication. So important, practically oriented set of topics for today. And I'd like to turn now to my colleague Greg Daniel, who's going to go over the agenda as well as some important housekeeping items to keep in mind throughout the day. Greg?
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to all of you for joining us this morning and to those of you who are following us via the webcast. I'm Greg Daniel. I'm Deputy Director in the new Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. And as Mark said, the Common REMS Platform is an important initiative that could help reduce the burden of implementing REMS requirements and thereby improving compliance with those requirements and patient outcomes. We're going to start off the day with remarks from Teresa Toigo, who is the Associate Director of Drugs at FDA, and she'll bring us up to speed on FDA's efforts to standardize and integrate REMS to date. Following that presentation, Adam Creet is the Policy and Informatics Advisor at the FDA, who is playing a major role in developing the Common REMS Platform initiative. He'll be presenting an overview of the program and lay out the vision for the platform and primus for the upcoming discussions throughout the next 2 sessions. We'll then open up our first panel session where we'll discuss how innovative new tools and systems could be developed under the Common REMS platform and possible strategies to further this development. So that will be the panel where we talk about innovative tools, electronic medical records, apps, other kinds of tools that could really help improve the REMS program. However, doing that will require us to bring standards together and to look at existing standards and potential new standards and collaborations. And that'll take us into our second session, which will focus on the data standards landscape and possible standards development infrastructure and collaboration that could be leveraged in order to facilitate the uptake of these tools and systems that were discussed in the previous session. We'll then close out this event with final remarks from Mark and ending at 12:15. Before we kick off, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. I want to remind everyone that this is a public event. We are webcasting in the back, which is live, so everything said is on the record, but please feel free to speak freely and bring all of your ideas, comments, concerns, and suggestions to the discussion. As you'll note in the 2 sessions, they are packed with panelists. We're giving 3 to 5 minutes only for our panelists so we can get through the discussion. Serena Coates is in the front here. Serena, just wave your, she'll let you know when your time is winding down as a panelist. And we want to get through the panelists because we did allow time in each session for active discussion among all of you. So we want you to be able to ask the panelists, bring your ideas forth, and we have a microphone on each table that can be passed around for you to do that. Lastly, please feel free to help yourself. We have beverages, coffee, sodas, water, etc., just outside the room. You're welcome to those throughout the meeting. And then now I'll turn it over to Teresa Toigo. Teresa?
Thank you, Greg, and good morning, everybody, and welcome. We appreciate you all joining us today. I'm actually surprised to see so many people interested in this topic, so that's very, very good for FDA. And so what I'm going to do is give a brief summary of REMS, what they are and how we use them, and then talk about how the REMS Integration Initiative has provided some structure for overseeing many of the REMS-related activities that are ongoing at FDA. But before I start, I'm interested in knowing a little bit from the audience about how many of the participants have a working knowledge of REMS from the healthcare perspective, where you've actually had to implement REMS in a healthcare institution. Okay. How many have been involved in developing REMS? You're either a company or you're working contractor for companies. Okay, and how many people have no practical experience with REMS? Okay, and so in the early days of we'd go to meetings and people would think they were coming to talk about rapid eye movements. We're well beyond that, but we do still have a few people that we need a little bit of background information on REMS. So I'm gonna go through it quickly. But again, REMS are drug safety measures that are targeted to circumstances in which FDA believes that additional measures beyond those mentioned in the drug labeling are needed to ensure that the benefits of a drug outweigh its risks. REMS do not represent the full benefit risk of a drug, the benefit risk profile, but instead they target 1 or 2 important risks. The REMS authority, as Mark said, was granted to us in 2007 with the passage of FDAA. The law contained provisions for changing and advancing ways FDA approaches drug safety issues for drugs and other medical products. And REMS was really one of the important changes with this law. So FDA can require a REMS before a drug is approved or after a drug is approved if we become aware of new safety information. When FDA requires a drug, it's the drug sponsor that develops the REMS, and FDA approves the REMS prior to its use. REMS elements are meant to serve as tools to help communicate about risks, inform prescribing decisions, support patient counseling, and help healthcare professionals establish and reinforce safe use conditions and behaviors. Depending on the risk involved, a REMS may contain a combination of any or all of the components that are listed on this slide. A medication guide or a patient package insert provides additional written drug information for the patient. A communication plan informs the healthcare community of a drug's risk, for example, through a Dear Healthcare Professional letter. Elements to assure safe use are the most restrictive types of REMS, and I'll talk more about them in the next slides. If the ATASU requirements are extensive, then the sponsor may be required to establish an implementation plan to help ensure that the requirements are effectively carried out. And as you can see on the last bullet, REMS also require that sponsors provide, that there is a timetable for sponsors to provide an assessment of the REMS. So elements to assure safe use are required medical interventions or other actions that healthcare professionals need to execute prior to prescribing or dispensing the drug to a patient. Some actions may also be required in order for the patient to continue on treatment. Elements to assure safe use will be the focus of the Common REMS platform that we'll be discussing today. So what are these ATASU requirements for our few people who are new to REMS? There are 6 elements under the ATASU REMS that may be required in the healthcare delivery and distribution system. Prescribers may be required to have specific training or experience or special certifications. For example, a healthcare professional may be required to demonstrate the ability to diagnose a condition for which a drug is indicated or agree to perform monitoring that might be required in the REMS. Pharmacies or healthcare settings may need to be specially certified. For example, a pharmacy may need to agree to fill a prescription only after checking a lab value. A drug may be able to only, in some cases, a drug may only be able to dispensed in certain healthcare settings, such as infusion centers or hospitals. For example, a facility's personnel would have to attest to the educational materials that they've been received and that they've been distributed to the appropriate staff. A drug can be dispensed only with evidence of safe use conditions, such as laboratory test results. And this, an example of this is a liver enzyme test or a pregnancy test. Each patient receiving the drug may be subject to monitoring. For example, patients may be required to have follow-up visits to physicians to make sure that they are still appropriate candidates for treatment. And the 6th element is each patient using the drug may be required to be enrolled in a registry. Depending on the risk, a REMS may require any or all of these measures. Following the early implementation of REMS, some stakeholders raised concerns about the impact of various REMS. FDA gathered some preliminary information from stakeholders, including a public meeting that we held in 2010, to obtain input from our stakeholders on the challenges associated with both the development and the implementation of REMS. Following the 2010 public meeting, FDA began a more formalized internal discussion about REMS. In 2011, we created the REMS Integration Initiative, designed to evaluate and improve implementation of our REMS authorities. The goal of the REMS Integration Initiative is as stated on this slide, developing guidance on how to apply statutory criteria to determine when a REMS is required, improve standardization and assessment of REMS, and improved integration of REMS into the existing and evolving healthcare system. And as you can see from this slide, there are 3 key components of the initiative. Stakeholder outreach to better understand how existing REMS programs are working and where the opportunities for improvement lie is a very important one. Standardization and integration into the healthcare practices. We need to consider questions like, how do we best balance customization and standardization? How much variation is necessary and unavoidable? What is the appropriate trade-off between enhanced safety and additional burden to the healthcare system associated with REMS? And bullet number 3 is the implementation of REMS commitments included in the PDUFA 5 guidance development that I know many are still are very interested in, and we are still working on the guidances that are required under PDUFA. And then there are 4 priority projects to address specific areas of improvement that I'll talk about in the next slide. So we took very seriously the PDUFA commitments related to gathering stakeholder input to better integrate REMS into our healthcare system. We've regularly sought and received stakeholder feedback with regard to REMS in a variety of forums: public meetings, public comment to a docket, advisory committee meetings, and listening sessions. Stakeholder feedback has really helped us to better understand the answer to questions like, where are things working? What do we need to fix? And where can we actually standardize? In September 2014, we issued a report on standardizing and evaluating REMS. It included recommendations received from stakeholders through a variety of methods. Stakeholder feedback also guided the agency in determining what would be the 4 priority projects under PDUFA. FDA was directed as part of the agency's PDUFA commitments to, I quote, identify at least 1 priority project, including a work plan for project completion in each of the 4 topic areas referenced on the slide: providing benefit risk information to patients, prescriber education, pharmacy systems, and practice settings. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in the next slides. But each project responds to input that FDA received regarding significant areas of opportunity for REMS standardization and evaluation efforts. The first project involved providing benefit risk information to patients, focusing on how to effectively counsel patients about medications that they're being considered for or medications they're actually using. And this project is focused on medications with REMS, although the implications are for medications that are not under a REMS. The first phase of this project included a review of public research on effective healthcare counseling. The Brookings Institution, in conjunction with FDA, developed a white paper synthesizing the literature review and identifying where there were gaps in knowledge. In July 2015, FDA participated in a Brookings expert workshop to obtain feedback on effective counseling processes, practices, techniques, and tools to incorporate into the framework. A second workshop was held in April 2016, and the paper is being refined based on the input that we got from stakeholders. And then we talked about it at our Drug Safety Board meeting in May of 2016. So our deliverable for this project is a report of findings, counseling processes, and tools that could serve as a basis for designing and validating them in demonstration projects. Project 2 focuses on prescriber education. During FDA's stakeholder engagement efforts, several groups expressed support for delivering REMS education through accredited CE providers and asked FDA to facilitate this effort as part of its strategy to address some of the deficiencies in the current program. The project is assessing the feasibility of incorporating CE into individual REMS programs that include a communication plan and/or healthcare professional training. We're defining objectives for REMS CE programs, and as listed on this slide, we're articulating approaches that, to achieving those objectives. We're examining the potential barriers to implementing these approaches, and then we're considering the ways to address these barriers that have been identified. Stakeholder outreach is continuing to identify possible approaches to REMS-related CE development, and our deliverable for this project is also a report of findings. So the fourth project is pharmacy systems. Structured product labeling is an HL7 standard used to capture structured product information that will include information about REMS, but not the REMS materials in a structured format. It's intended to address multiple stakeholder concerns about REMS information being communicated to stakeholders in a clear and consistent manner, and that the information is difficult to locate. Some stakeholders have difficulty integrating REMS materials and procedures into their existing healthcare information systems and healthcare delivery processes. We've completed a successful pilot with 9 companies to test and refine FDA's approach to integrating REMS into SPL, and I see some of the companies who volunteered to work on this project with us in the audience, and so I thank you for that. We've learned a lot from the pilot. We think this project will address many of the concerns that were previously described regarding REMS, because SPL information can be easily shared and made available, and it's readily incorporated into health IT. The REMS at FDA website is another PDUFA 5 priority project for REMS standardization. The purpose of this project is to enhance the REMS website, providing a centralized, standardized, reliable, and user-friendly repository of information about REMS. It's intended to help stakeholders minimize confusion and provide access to convenient, up-to-date, and comprehensive REMS information. We launched the website in June of 2015 and did some focus testing in August and September. We're continuing to evaluate the website to inform and prioritize potential future updates. So what about the future? Well, we still have a lot more to do. We remain committed to improvement of REMS program implementation, and we'll continue to gather stakeholder input. At our public meeting, as Mark mentioned, in October 2015, we discussed the Common REMS platform as what we see as the next step to further enhancing and improving REMS integration into the healthcare system. We received a lot of positive feedback at that October meeting, and we've continued to work on this project, as you will hear from Adam Creet and others. We look forward to working with you and refining the project further. Thank you for your participation in today's meeting, and we look forward to your involvement and working with us.
All right, thanks, Terry, for that overview of all that's going on with REMS. It's very nice to see such a collaborative process taking place. And as Terry mentioned, now we want to turn to the main topic of the day, which Adam Creet is going to introduce, and that's by providing an overview of the Common REMS platform. So, Adam, if you want to come on up.
Thanks, Terry, and thank you, Mark. I'm Adam Creet. I'm at the FDA, and I've been helping to lead a lot of the development of the Common REMS Platform initiative here, and I'm really excited to tell you more about it. I think it really is, in a lot of ways, the culmination of a lot of the efforts that we've been putting forward so far to standardize REMS and better integrate them into the healthcare system. So I'm very excited to be talking about it today. Let's see if I can find my slides. There we go. So I know you all want to hear more about the platform, but just want to quickly go over a few things before that. So I'll start off by providing a little bit of a background on the use of health data standards in REMS, some of the existing efforts that we have going on to do so, and then I'm going to get into introducing the REMS platform. I'm hoping by teeing up these issues before, you'll start to understand what we might be able to accomplish with a Common REMS platform in place. And for some of you who were able to attend the October 2015 FDA meeting, a lot of what I'm talking about today will be very similar to that, but I'm going to go into a little more detail on what exactly we have planned for the platform. So Terry's touched on the topic of standardization and its role in the REMS integration initiative, and I just wanted to quickly recap why we think standardization is so important, because that really sets the stage for why we're doing this Common REMS platform. And one reason is that standardization lets us continually improve REMS design. Those of you who've worked with multiple REMS, maybe developed multiple REMS, know that they often work similarly and use similar tools. And that means that they face similar issues. How do we make them less burdensome? How do we get stakeholders to comply with the REMS requirements? How do we make sure they're working well? And it's really difficult often when you're scrambling to get a REMS when a drug is being submitted to FDA, to sort through all those questions. So when you standardize, you have the opportunity to work together to solve those problems for everybody, rather than asking any individual sponsor or asking just FDA even to shoulder the burden of researching and answering all those questions about how to make REMS work well. We're able to collaboratively answer those questions and then incorporate that into our standardized approach. And then also another reason that standards are important is that they create predictability. So even if we didn't know anything about best practices, it's good to just be standardized so that you know what to expect. When REMS don't work similarly, or say you're a healthcare provider and a new REMS comes in and it doesn't work like the other REMS that you've used, it can cause confusion, it can lead to errors. Third, when you put standards in place, you have the capacity to produce what we call positive network effects. And that's the idea that as you proliferate standards, they're even more valuable to the people who adopt them. A classic example of this is the telephone. So the more people that have a phone, the more valuable each telephone was to its owner. And the same goes for REMS standards. The more REMS are standardized, the more each stakeholder has to gain from adopting those standards. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, standardization is the first step to process improvement and a quality systems approach to care. Processes that have lots of variability are harder to improve and are more error-prone. And that makes sense from an investment perspective. I mean, imagine yourself as a hospital. You have to deal with a dozen different REMS, all of which are working slightly differently. You don't necessarily have the capacity to make sure that each and every one is being implemented as efficiently and as effectively as possible. But if they're standardized, then you have the ability to invest more resources into improving your implementation of REMS. So that's a big motivation for why we are moving towards a common REMS platform. We want to see those standards actually improve not only just the efficiency, but also the quality of care. So that brings us specifically to the topic of data standards. We think that these standards are some of the most powerful tools that we have to standardize REMS in a really collaborative way. And that's really key because we know that different REMS work differently, that different healthcare providers have different practices, and we're fortunate in that healthcare data standards can help us bridge those gaps and build a common approach that works for everyone. So standards are really at their core just a common way of electronically communicating health information. And they allow healthcare providers to work together in a large and increasingly complex and increasingly electronic healthcare system. A couple important things to note about these, and a lot of you are far more familiar with these than I am. They have a couple distinctive features. One is that they're not developed by FDA. They're not developed by the government necessarily. Typically, these are built by standards development organizations that have, like NCPDP and HL7, both of which are represented here today. And they are developed collaboratively, and then they're adopted by stakeholders. So they don't just automatically kick in. People have to actually make the choice to adopt them and start using them. And despite the value and increasing use of healthcare data standards throughout the healthcare system, we haven't seen much use of these standards in REMS. And that's in part because of the history of the REMS program. It was approved in 2008 when less than 10% of prescribers were e-prescribing. And now 70% are doing so. And this is a slide from ONC. I think some of you may have noticed that. But that's starting to change, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the efforts that we have introduced or that others have introduced to help incorporate data standards and standards into REMS, and this will help set the stage for understanding what we're trying to accomplish with the Common REMS platform. And I'm going to talk specifically about three things. Number one is an effort to create standards for how the REMS is described, and this is the SPL project that Terry was talking about. One thing that's important to note is that this isn't part of the Common REMS platform, but this is something that we think is going to really help push that Common REMS platform along. And later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about how all these different pieces fit together. But for now, try to kind of store this all in your head, because it'll all come together later. The second thing I'll talk about is standards that are being developed for how dispensers, how pharmacists verify that safe use conditions are in place when they're dispensing a REMS drug. And then finally, the standards for how prescribers document that safe use conditions are in place at the time that they're actually prescribing the drug. These are things that are already in the works or already out there. So starting with REMS SPL. Terry mentioned that this is one of our priority projects for standardizing REMS, and the idea for it actually came largely from our stakeholder outreach and with a big boost from our colleagues at the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, NCPDP, who originally floated this idea to us in 2013. So structured product labeling, or SPL, is a data standard that's used to share information about medical products, and that includes drug labels, but it also includes information beyond labeling. And part of the reason that we wanted to incorporate SPL, REMS information into SPL, is that it's really well equipped to capture this kind of information. It unites the REMS information with other relevant product information. So SPL is already the format that's being used to store information about drug labeling, which is one piece of really important information you need in order to be able to use the drug safely. But we consider REMS to also be really important information you need to be able to use the drug safely. So incorporating REMS information into SPL helps unite those two things. And then it's also already got an infrastructure in place so that when you've got information in SPL, it's propagated throughout the healthcare system. It's made available to health IT systems. And I'll talk a little bit about how that infrastructure works in a moment. So in September 2015, September 2015, we announced this as a PDUFA 6 priority project, one of the projects that Terry mentioned. Or was it 2015 or 2014? Oh, PDUFA 5, okay. That's right, I'm mixing up my PDUFAs. So quick overview of what SPL looks like. So first thing that's important to understand is the kind of the model behind SPL. The way the information is structured is around what we call the 4 W's of the REMS. And that is the who, that is who is the stakeholder that may have to do something in the REMS. For instance, a prescriber or a pharmacist or a certain healthcare setting like a hospital. The next W is the when, so that's the particular stage in the treatment process when a REMS activity may need to occur. So certification, for instance, that was something that Terry mentioned in her overview. That's a very common thing that a lot of REMS require you to do. Prescribing, dispensing, administration of the drug. Then the third item, the third W is the what, and this is any clinical or administrative activity that must be performed as part of the REMS. And then finally, the with what, and this is kind of the material that the REMS uses. So we mentioned before that REMS often provide, say, training to prescribers, and they'll include training materials to help accomplish that. And so each of those W's is captured in something that we call a REMS SPL data element, and each W is represented by a different data element that you see on that table there. So the idea is that the REMS information, the SPL will capture this the official REMS materials, but it will structure them in a way that is consistent with the 4 W's. And it starts with the REMS document. This is the document that the sponsor submits to us that describes, and it's made available on our website, REMS@FDA, and this describes how the REMS essentially works. It provides an overview of what the requirements are under the REMS. And we start by standardizing that into something that we call the REMS summary. It's because the REMS document itself isn't aligned according to these 4 W's, the summaries are. So you'll take different REMS document text, and an example on this slide here is 3 chunks of text from different REMS documents that are describing very, very similar requirements, and they're captured in a REMS summary in a standardized way. And this is a tabular format that's easy to read, easy to follow, and captures the REMS in that 4W format I talked about before. Then we take each of those summaries and code them as standardized data elements. And this coding part is really key because this is how you can actually take that information that you as a human being can read and put it into a format that, say, a computer can read, a health IT system can read. So in the example here, you'll see that we have captured all of those requirements that were in the original REMS document with the same standardized data elements so that you can start looking across REMS and understanding what the common points are. Once these summaries are all done, it's incorporated into this SPL document, and you don't have to worry about all the code there. What's important to understand here is that each SPL document is formatted in a common way that can be grabbed and incorporated into health IT systems with the who, what, when, and using what, those 4 W's of the REMS captured in that REMS SPL document. And that can then be shared throughout the healthcare system. So the SPL data is transmitted from the sponsor. That's over there on the left of that diagram. It's sent to us. We then put it in an NIH NLM repository, and that's DailyMed. And then information from DailyMed is shared across the healthcare system. Drug data vendors pick that up. They incorporate it. They then provide that to health IT vendors who put it into health IT products. So this entire workflow is designed to get information from that SPL format, which initially looked like this, into, say, a pop-up window in your healthcare system. So that's a really useful pathway to be able to leverage for REMS. So SPL so far, Terry mentioned that we have a pilot kicked off, and we had 9 sponsors, and we just wrapped up that pilot, and we're putting the finishing touches on some of the materials associated with SPL, including an implementation guide. And so we're hoping to be able to launch REMS SPL this summer. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, is another effort to incorporate standards into REMS, and this one is potentially something that could be made part of the REMS platform, and that is the standards for verifying safe use conditions. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail because one of our panelists is going to be discussing this a little later, but I'll just quickly go over it. Several years ago, FDA approached pharmacy groups and asked them how to better integrate REMS and the safety checks that REMS require into their workflow. And the overwhelming response that we heard from those pharmacists was that we should incorporate these into the existing standard, the NCPDP standard called telecommunications, which is already in place and already in use by pharmacies to handle third-party billing. So what does third-party billing have to do with safety checks? Well, it just turns out that that standard was already able to provide certain alerts and what you might call hard stops at the pharmacy, where there was an opportunity to communicate with a third party and make sure that all of these certain requirements have been met before dispensing. And so they felt like it was a really good opportunity to incorporate REMS safety checks. And so the NCPDP actually took the lead on this, and they developed an implementation guide that explained how their existing telecommunications standard could be used to verify safe use conditions in REMS. And just to provide a quick overview of how that works, the standard simply allows retail pharmacies to verify that safe use conditions while they submit their claims. So the claim is sent from the pharmacy to a body called a switch, which is responsible for normally is responsible for sending those claims to the insurer. But before they send the claim to the insurer, they send the relevant REMS information on to the REMS, what's called in this diagram the REMS administrator, and that is whoever's managing the REMS program. And then if certain safe use conditions are in place, or not in place, for instance, a required lab test hasn't been completed, the REMS program can actually let the pharmacist know before they hand that drug to a patient that that something else needs to get done. So far, there actually already are multiple REMS that are using this, what we call switch system, to verify that there are safe use conditions in place. And we've heard a lot of positive feedback. For those who've been able to make use of the system, it's worked really, really well for them, and it gives them extra assurance that the REMS safety checks are reliably getting done every time the drug is dispensed. NCPDP is now leading another effort, which again, you're going to hear a little bit more about later, to further the use of standards and REMS by incorporating these information about safe use conditions and making sure that they're documented in the prescriber's office. So not just on the pharmacy side, but now on the prescriber side. And they're doing that through their script e-prescribing standard. And in the proposed approach that they've been working on, the REMS program can present a prescriber with a question set through the EHR. And this is similar to what you might see in prior authorization. And the prescriber, by answering those questions, can document that the REMS safe use conditions have been met for that prescription. And I'll add that this is a really good example, I think, of how standards can support integration by aligning with existing processes. It turns out that a lot of the activities that are done in REMS are similar to processes that are already in place in the healthcare system. And you can see that at the bottom of this slide. There are 2 chunks of text here. One is text from a prior authorization pop-up window that appears when you prescribe a transmucosal immediate release fentanyl product. And then the one below it is the actual warning that the REMS itself is using. And you may not be able to read it from back here, but they're very, very similar to each other. So there's a case where there's an existing standard, there's an existing process that's very similar to a REMS process. And I'm hoping that as we think about REMS platform standards later today, that we can keep this idea in mind, that one of the best ways to get adoption, to get some REMS standards in place, is to repurpose existing standards and existing processes. So, all right, so I just talked about a few examples of how standards are being used to help integrate REMS into the healthcare system and reduce the burden. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Common REMS platform fits into this and how we can use that platform to advance these standards even further. And the platform was really developed in response to a concern of ours, which was that even though there was already a lot of activity out there in the standards world on REMS, we found that a lot of REMS activities and healthcare settings are not necessarily addressed by the standards that are out there. So, for instance, there aren't a lot of standards out there that are addressing hospitals, let's say. And then also, a lot of REMS that could theoretically have adopted these standards haven't yet. And so, what we were concerned about was that we were not really doing enough to push these standards and really advance them along. And without widespread adoption of those standards, you don't get those network effects that we talked about earlier. The idea that the more people who adopt standards, the more everybody benefits from their use. So the REMS platform is designed to address those problems. And it's really, those of you who are familiar with the platform probably think about it in terms of computer operating systems. And I think the concept we're referring to has a lot of similarities to that. And that is, for example, when you want to build software for a smartphone, you don't have to build a different piece of software for every single smartphone. They run just a couple of platforms, iOS, Android, and you develop one piece of software and it works on everybody's phones, even though there are all kinds of shapes and sizes and models of phone. So the existence of a platform kind of prevents duplication of effort, and it allows for standard practices and it actually helps facilitate innovation because you're able to develop something once and have it used much more broadly. And we'd like to really be able to create something similar for REMS. Now, I mentioned, and others have mentioned before, that the REMS platform as we envision it, it's not a hub, it's not a piece of software. Really, all it is a set of electronic data standards by which REMS can operate and communicate, and then it's a process for creating or updating the standards as we add them to this kind of catalog of REMS standards. So let's talk a little bit more about that process. It's really we divide it into 3 phases: standards development, standards acceptance, and standards adoption. Standards development starts with understanding exactly what it is we want to build standards around, and that means developing what we call a use case. And a use case is essentially just a description of the REMS activity to be standardized and how stakeholders and systems interact to perform that activity and what the standard needs to accomplish. And so I've listed a few possible REMS use cases up here. That includes perhaps healthcare provider enrollment and certification, patient enrollment agreement, documentation of safe use conditions. These are all activities that are very common across a wide range of REMS. And this is a really crucial step because the use case essentially is telling you what the standard needs to be able to do. And later today, we're going to be talking about a specific use case. And some of you will be sticking around after this public meeting ends to participate in an expert workshop to go through this in detail. And that's the use case for prescriber certification. And we decided that would be a really good one to start with because that's a use case that's very widespread across many of the REMS with elements to assure safe use. The diagram here, I won't go through it in detail, but this is the draft process that we've developed as part of that use case. And what you'll notice if you could read it, it's not really a technical document. All it is really just a flow that explains how the process works. And you'll see in some of those colorful boxes over there, those are the areas where information is being exchanged. And that's where the standards are going to come in. And so the goal of the use case is to help us understand what role the standards are going to play in the process and what the standards need to be able to accomplish. So once you've actually built that use case, then it becomes possible to identify the existing standards that may be able to apply to it. And this diagram on the left side, you'll see a set of those possible REMS use cases that I just mentioned. And then on the right, you see a set of data standards that might potentially be addressed, that might potentially address those use cases. And so the idea is that we can identify a set of potential standards and identify the most appropriate standard for each use case. And part of the reason we've brought you all together is that we're hoping that you can help us identify perhaps what some of those standards are that might help us address some of these use cases. In the example here, you can see that the use case for verification of safe use conditions at the pharmacy is mapped against that NCPDP telecommunication standard. So that's already one example of how a use case was built and a standard was identified that could address that use case. And it was an existing standard, so nothing had to be developed from scratch. So once a standard has been identified, we then work with standards development organizations who develop that standard to develop implementation guides. And those are guides that describe precisely how those standards would be used to carry out REMS activities. So the example here shows an excerpt from NCPDP's draft implementation guide for using its e-prescribing script standard to help prescribers document safe use conditions in REMS. So ideally, we'd also want to be able to pilot this standard to make sure that it works outside of the world of technical specifications in the real world. So going back really quickly for a second, I mentioned that there are 3 major steps in the REMS platform process. So what we just covered here, creating that use case, identifying what the standardization needs are, working with a standards development organization to help develop a standard and implementation guides. That's that standards development stage. So now what I'm going to do is jump into the standards acceptance phase, and that involves adding standards to a standards catalog. And so this is a sample screenshot of another FDA standards catalog that we actually use for study data standards. So this is a model that we found has been very successful in the past, is for us to simply help everybody understand what the relevant standards are out there. And this is also a catalog that can change over time. So we can add more standards to the set, and as standards evolve, we can make sure that we can evolve the implementation guides that are referenced in this catalog. And then with those standards established, we now are on to that phase 3, standards adoption, and we have our common REMS platform. So at this point, we've got a set of standards, and it's time to develop tools for that platform. And the diagram on the right here kind of gives you an idea of how that might work. So at the center of the diagram, you see the healthcare providers. These are prescribers and dispensers. And within each of those, you'll see the various methods, and it's probably a little difficult to read there, but you'll see the methods by which the healthcare providers might interface with the platform REMS, which are mapped through those arrows going back and forth. So those REMS platform standards are really designed to help facilitate communication between prescribers and dispensers and the platform REMS. And the interface by which those prescribers and dispensers actually interact could be a variety of things. It could be an electronic health record, it could be a centralized website, it could be a smartphone app, and with the platform standards in place, it's possible for anybody to create tools that can work with the platform REMS. And our goal would be to eventually encourage the development of those tools. And we're hoping to also spend some time today thinking about, well, what might those tools be? How might they work? We think that the platform will really potentially open up a whole new range of possibilities that are very difficult right now because REMS aren't standardized. On top of the diagram, you see SPL, and I've talked a little bit about how SPL works. And the key thing to note here is that SPL has the potential, through the structured data that it provides, to provide what we might call triggers to the healthcare providers that would let them know that they could kick off using a REMS requirement. So establishing a REMS platform is going to have a lot of different benefits for stakeholders. And first and foremost, it's going to reduce the amount of work that healthcare providers have to do to integrate REMS into their processes. So for REMS integration to work, healthcare providers and sponsors really have to meet each other halfway. First, sponsors have to set up their REMS in such a way that it's possible for stakeholders to integrate REMS into their processes. And then stakeholders, participants in the REMS, have to take steps to modify or adapt their processes to accommodate the REMS. So when REMS are standardized in a single platform, it makes both of these steps a lot simpler. Sponsors just have to adopt the platform to facilitate integration, and then all stakeholders have to do is modify their internal systems and processes just once, instead of one time for each REMS, just once, to accommodate the platform, and that will allow them to work with all of the platform REMS. The other advantage is that it can improve REMS processes, because as I mentioned before, any effort that you make to improve compliance with one platform REMS is going to benefit your compliance with all of them. So instead of having to, say, deal with a dozen REMS and try to improve your processes a dozen different times, you're just executing one process improvement effort and one integration effort. It also can potentially make REMS simpler and perhaps even less expensive to develop, because the platform really is creating the standards that allow you to build REMS from interchangeable parts. So if you were developing a tool that would facilitate certification in one REMS, assuming that certification process followed those REMS platform standards, you could then reuse that certification module in any other REMS that's adopting the REMS platform standards. It can also help make the REMS more standardized and more predictable, and we talked a bit about the importance of predictability. And then finally, we believe that it can help create centralized REMS tools and resources. So a common REMS platform built around common standards allows you to create tools that could allow stakeholders to interact with any REMS from a standard location. For instance, you might have a general purpose website or app that would allow you to, or an electronic health records module that would allow you to, from a single place, interact with any REMS. Right now, if you go to, say, one REMS, you might be required to complete a PDF. You go to another REMS, you might have to fill in information on a website. So the idea is that with the standards in place, you can actually interact with the REMS in a single, central, standardized way. So as you can probably tell, we're really excited about the prospect of a common REMS platform to improve the quality of REMS programs. But we're really just getting started. And to make this successful, we really need your support and your active participation. This is a collaborative effort. And that starts with helping us answer some of the questions that we see up here. And we're going to be talking about those for the rest of this morning and the rest of today. And that first question, how can a common REMS platform help foster innovation and improve care? So this is really kind of thinking about what is the end state that we want to be able to reach when we have a REMS platform built. The next question is, how can we effectively work together to advance the REMS platform? I've mentioned that we aren't the ones who develop the standards. We're not necessarily even going to be the ones who identify what standards are needed. To really make this all work, we're going to need to actively collaborate. And that gets us to the third question. What does a successful collaboration look like? I think that this meeting, in a way, we want to learn as much as we can, but we also want to kind of, at another level, we want to understand today what works well and what are effective ways to get input and get collaboration. So we're hoping that we'll take the lessons we learned from today and apply that to future collaborations and future meetings on this topic. So beyond today, we hope to be able to keep all of you in the room, and we have an afternoon session already, but even if you're not involved in that, we hope to keep all of you involved. And we see you as kind of a community of interest for the platform. And so we hope this meeting is the first of many discussions and many collaborations to come. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. We have a little bit of time for questions for Adam about what he presented on the REMS Common Platform and also about the broader context and REMS policy and program development that's taking place here. If you all have any questions, please raise your hand, and then there are microphones on each table. So just let me know if there are any while I'm waiting for the audience to warm up a little bit. Adam, let me ask you. You laid out some good reasons why a REMS Common Platform would be helpful for providers in dealing with REMS programs more efficiently, for patients, and using medications, gaining access effectively for manufacturers, and smoother processes. That all sounds good. What's your sense about how much work it's going to take to build on the existing platforms? I mean, in one sense, it doesn't seem that difficult. There already are existing ways to handle in the common platforms for e-prescribing, things like identifying whether certain characteristics of a provider are present, so not that different conceptually from REMS certification. Systems that exist now to handle patient characteristics for things like utilization review and the like, so again, doesn't seem that conceptually different. How big of a lift is this going to be?
So my take is that I think, by and large, what REMS are doing is, as you mentioned, it's not unique. That a lot of the activities that are being carried out by REMS, there are very similar activities that are being carried out elsewhere. So we do hope that we won't need to develop new standards from scratch. That we'll be able to leverage a lot of the work that's already going on. In my mind, I think the most difficult part might actually be these use cases, and that's part of why we're devoting a big chunk of time to that this afternoon. The use cases where you clearly specify what it is you need the standards to accomplish. And REMS can be pretty complex. They have a lot of nuances. There are a lot of places where they vary. And that means that when you build standards around them, you need to make sure that they accommodate that variety. So we think of it kind of as standardization, but allowing for customization. So thinking through those problems is going to take some work. But once we've sorted through what we need the standards to accomplish and how they can do that in a customized but standardized way, we think that the next steps will move along really well.
Great. Again, yes, Paul, go ahead.
Hi, Adam. Great work. Paul Seligman from Amgen. How do you view these platforms as being sort of different or distinguishable from other efforts to manage high-risk products, such as anticoagulants that may already sort of be built into certain healthcare systems? And maybe are there some lessons learned or commonalities or maybe some opportunities to sort of draw on some of these other, approaches to managing high-risk medicines?
I think that would be, I think it would be great to take a look at what's already being done out there to manage these kinds of medicines. And often there are healthcare data standards that are underlying those efforts that we could potentially leverage in the REMS platform. So if you're aware of relevant efforts, we would love to hear more about them. I think that is potentially a really good approach. And that's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about repurposing existing processes.
Other questions? Yes. Right on the table.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. Start over again. Okay, my name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. I think all this purpose is to improve the health care and improve the quality of every stage of process. So I just wonder, how do you assure from data collections, input of the electronic data, and dispensing of drug or providers' health services to be correct and according to ethic and moral value? What I try to say is a lot of misconduct involved in all this process, whether it's dispensing or whether it's doctors or whether it's a prescriber. And even the electronic, there's a hacker, so all this can be manipulated to be, in a great extent, is incorrect and opposite direction to our healthcare purpose.
So can this help increase the accuracy of predictions, prevent fraud, that sort of thing?
Well, we actually, in our role at FDA overseeing REMS, we do ask companies to assess their REMS. We also have a whole compliance group that helps make sure that the REMS requirements are actually being followed and that those issues that you mentioned are addressed, and they're here today, and they may be able to help answer that question for me if you have anything to add. But I would say in general that we think the REMS platform has the potential to help address a lot of those data quality and integrity issues because you've started to develop standards for how that information is collected and exchanged. And there's also one of the questions that we're going to pose to the first panel is about how you integrate REMS into what you might call the learning health system. So the idea is that you're able to grab information and not only improve the quality of the REMS processes kind of out there in the world, but then use the information derived from those processes to actually make further improvements to the quality of care. And so we're hoping that the existence of platform standards will make that a lot simpler.
Mark?
So thanks very much for all the hard work you guys have been doing to evolve this over the last years. The question I have is can you say a few words about how this applies to devices? And thinking about and obviously there's different groups within the FDA, but it seems to me that there's a huge overlap with the issues that the device organizations are dealing with every day, and that's only going to get greater.
So I will say that devices are not exactly within our purview, and we don't have REMS for devices. I think it gets back to Paul's point, which is that when we see that there are processes out there that are working well, we can learn from them, and we can help integrate those ideas into the platform standards. And so, and that kind of interaction can also go the other way. As we identify best practices for managing the risks of drugs through the REMS platform, we might find that other groups, say device makers, even makers of non-REMS drugs, may want to take a look at the standards we've developed and learn lessons from how they can be used to increase their safety elsewhere.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Veronica Urdaneta from Merck. one of the big problems that we have for the REMS have to do with the providers' education, the requirements they have to do fulfilling the education requirements. How you're going to incorporate that in how you're going to make them do that when there are so many other education sources that they tend to go to, and one of the big issues have to do the REMS for opioids, for example, where you have REMS or training from the NIH or REMS courses from many other sources that clinicians have to take or wants to do instead of doing the one that belongs to the REM. So how you're going to make them do the one that is part of the REMS instead of doing any other ones, and how you're going to capture that and make that of the standards for the platform.
So I will say that what the platform standards are really focused on are the kind of the operational aspects of the REMS, the exchange of information back and forth, particularly between healthcare providers and the drug manufacturer or the sponsor. So that the question I think you're asking is about kind of making sure that patients are reading the right educational materials. And what we can do through the REMS platform is make sure that those materials are presented to whoever needs them in the right place at the right time. But then when it comes to the actual content of those materials, I think that's something that's a little outside the scope of the platform. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, really, because for a prescriber to be able to prescribe that product that it has a REM, have to take have to comply with certain education requirements.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So how you're going to capture that part of the REMS for that provider, incorporate that as part of the platform, because for the provider to enter that into the e-prescribing, they have to be taking that educational session, and then the pharmacy have to make sure that that provider is certified to do that prescribing.
Got it. Yeah. So this is actually something that we've started building a use case around, is helping to make sure that a prescriber, before they are able to prescribe the drug, has received any training that the REMS requires. And so I mentioned that use case development is the really challenging part. So we've started sketching out exactly what it would take from a standards perspective to be able to support that, and we're hoping to actually have a little bit more of a conversation about that soon.
So for this use case to work, the platform would have to be able to take in really potentially a wide range of courses or educational activities that meet the certification requirements.
Yeah, and I think the way that we would manage that is the REMS is already set up so that it can, the REMS SPL actually is already set up so that it can help facilitate the provision of those educational materials and information about where to get that training. That's possible through the SPL to populate a prescriber's, say, electronic health record and alert them to the need to do that kind of training. And then the REMS platform can be used to help the prescriber send evidence that they've completed that training to the drug manufacturer, and that evidence can be used can then be forwarded on to the dispenser so that they know that the patient has been prescribed the drug by a prescriber who has received the education. So it's a bit of a complex chain, and we started to sketch all of those steps out, and the goal is, in fact, to be able to do what you're talking about, to make sure that the prescribers receive the right education at the right time before they prescribe the drug in a standardized way.
I mean, it is a bit of a complex process, but the intent is to make it simpler for the prescriber. So they do a certified education program. It can then be readily determined that they are certified. So that's the use case turning into a business case for why people might want to do this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're describing, it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts that have to come together in the dispensing of the drug, the pharmacy, education, et cetera, and that's very impressive for all those to come together. And is there remedy or enforcement, or like what happens if it doesn't come together? I mean, what happens if it does the pharmacist not sell the drug at the counter? Does the pharmacy sell the drug and then they go to the person's house and pick it up, because they shouldn't have sold the drug? Like what happens, let's say it doesn't work as planned, what happens then?
So typically, we don't have any authority as FDA to tell pharmacists directly what to do. Our authority is really over the drug manufacturers. And so what we do when we require REMS is we ask the manufacturer to set up a system that makes sure that the pharmacy can't even get the drug until they've agreed to perform those kinds of safety checks. And then they report back to us periodically on the manufacturer, that is, on how that's going. And we look for ways to improve the system if we find out that there are cases where, for instance, a patient is getting a drug without perhaps some laboratory testing having been done. So we keep a very close eye on those programs. At the same time, we do try to balance that against access considerations. There are some drugs that patients, where if a REMS requirement is not met, you might not want to withhold the drug from a patient. You might just want to flag the issue and try to find a way to resolve it as quickly as possible. So it'll vary a little bit depending on the REMS, but overall, we've got a framework in place that we think kind of helps assure that all of those requirements that we've put in place are actually followed.
I mean, it does sound like the goal here is to use this approach to bring down the cost or the burden of complying with REMS requirements and improve access to REMS drugs for appropriate patient use. And if the use case isn't achieving that, then it's not going to be adopted. But that's the whole point of doing this exercise. It does seem like, from what you said earlier, there's some real opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, that's true. We think that adoption will be driven by the fact that it's going to make your life easier, and it's going to make these systems can be complex. There are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of steps, and by kind of standardizing them, you help reduce the burden that they impose on everybody.
So last question, timing for implementation. I know this is a collaborative process. It's starting with getting the use cases right, and then it's going to be implementation from there. Any sense of how quickly you expect this process to proceed?
So I don't expect one day for us to unveil, here are the 20 standards, here's your platform, we're done. I think this is going to be an ongoing process. Where we're going to continue to iteratively start working through use cases, getting standards built. I mean, those of you who have been in the front lines helping to create these standards that are already out there know that this is a process that's sometimes unpredictable in its timing, and that requires kind of learning and iteration. So I don't think there's a hard date that I can give you that says this is the day we introduce the platform. It's gonna be an ongoing process.
Time for one more quick question in the back.
Thank you. Do you expect FDA to issue some guidance or regular, changes in the regulation? Because SPL has a certain regulatory requirement for content of labeling and then associated data. Do you think that's will be required, or how would the manufacturer or the sponsor would comply with that?
I don't think we've made any determinations yet on that particular issue when it comes to the REMS platform. I should note this is getting a little bit into legal minutia, but the laws and regulations that pertain to SPL wouldn't necessarily apply to the other standards that we're talking about for the REMS platform. So it would have to work a little differently than that. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Well, and we're not going to answer all questions this morning, but I think Adam's done a great job of teeing up some of the issues that do need to be worked through in the context of use cases and the other practical steps towards implementing this kind of common REMS platform. So, Adam, thank you very much for joining us this morning. I look forward to some further discussion as we continue the day. Right now, I'd like to ask our first panel to head up to the stage. While I'm introducing them, Adam mentioned that one goal of this first panel is about connecting the vision that's been described here for a common REMS platform to the other steps that are taking place in seeking to move our country to a learning healthcare system that's based on effective interoperable data systems and practical use cases like the common REMS platform could provide. So we've heard about some of the policy aims, some of the potential benefits from standardizing and integrating REMS into these emerging emerging health information technology systems. Now we're going to hear from a range of stakeholders who are going to help us think about some of the key opportunities for the development of the health IT systems and tools under the platform, and we're going to try to keep with some specific examples, this notion of use cases that Adam mentioned earlier. We're also going to hear about possible strategies to help more broadly facilitate these kinds of systems and tool development. So on our panel this morning, we have Shelley Spiro, the Executive Director of Pharmacy Health Information Technology Collaborative, Marie Link, the founder and president of REMS Logic, and I take it as Terry mentioned earlier, that's not rapid eye movement logic. Roger Pinsino, the senior director for business development and vice president for product innovation at Gemini Health. Paul Sheehan, the executive director and head of U.S. REMS for Celgene. Annette Stemhagen, the senior vice president of safety, epidemiology, registries, and risk management at United Biosource. And Katie Stabe, the clinical coordinator for drug use policy and compliance at University of Chicago Medicine. So we're looking forward to hearing some opening comments from each of our panelists. As Greg pointed out earlier, I'd like to make sure you know I've been introduced to Serena up here in the front row. Say hi again, Serena. So we are asking you to keep the comments fairly brief, even though these are some really interesting and important topics, so that we have some time for a discussion with the rest of the group here today. So Shelley, can we start with you?
Thank you. Good. This is on? Mm-hmm. Good. As Mark had said, my name is Shelley Spiro. I'm the Executive Director of the Pharmacy HIT Collaborative, a collaborative that was formed by the 9 pharmacy professional associations. And when we look at innovation and we look at where REMS really fits into the entire picture of really where we engage our patient, which is the overall aspect of where we want to be eventually in the future, where REMS fits into the care of our patients. And this is how do we actually document the information, and where do we really engage that patient? Now, the REMS platform will help take that discrete data, standardize that data in a way that we, from the health IT standpoint, can begin to incorporate that information to document what we're doing with our patients, but also be able to share that information with all members of the healthcare team. The reason these medications are high risk is for a certain reason, and that high risk means that it's probably for a chronically ill patient or a patient who needs some type of chronic care management. And where we've gone in the future, into the future of what we're looking at in sharing this information is using electronic structured documents through HL7 standards. There are projects that we're working on in conjunction with NCPDP and HL7 to incorporate some of this discrete data into the way that pharmacists and prescribers document the information into their systems, but more importantly, begin to share that information with the healthcare team. And this is an important aspect of what we're working on as we move forward with how do we identify medications related to risk, where those risks are important for not only those who are prescribing, dispensing, counseling the patient through medication management, but also having that information being shared with other members of the healthcare team and the patients themselves. Many of these patients have caregivers who have to also be part of that process. And so as we move forward with more innovative ideas, this is an important aspect of where we need to go in the future.
Great. Thank you very much. And next is Marie.
Hello?
Yeah, just give it a second.
Okay, I apologize in advance if this is a little detailed and complex, but I'm going to bear with me. For the purpose of today's SPL project, I will discuss several existing systems whose capabilities should be considered for supporting SPL output, and will highlight only those systems whose services may be expanded to manage national REMS activities. I performed a simple gap analysis of all the REMS programs to outline a comprehensive anatomy of a REMS, to ensure that all the elements are accounted for as a patient journeys through the healthcare continuum. Today, we will focus on 3 REMS elements education, enrollment, and monitoring. Each element will further then be divided into 3 IT channels: 1, notification of the element; 2, delivery of the element; and 3, verification and tracking of the element. These IT channels are meant to ensure that there's appropriate SPL routing. So notification is the process by which the user or recipient is made aware of the particular REMS element. Delivery is the process by which the user or recipient receives the information and materials to carry out the REMS element. And then verification and tracking is simply the purpose by which the status of the user's activity can be referenced. So today I was asked to look at REMS with the TASU. So the element of prescriber education that was talked about earlier is actually a prerequisite or something that should be carried out prior to the patient-provider encounter. Notification of a prescriber's education can be carried out through using the EHR drug data feed and third-party integrations, or something that could be considered as prescriber-physician credentialing systems. Credentialing management platforms are traditionally part of the physician compliance office under the office of the CMO. Delivery of the education could occur via LMSs or learning management systems or telemedicine. Then you have the point of prescribing. REMS patient-specific elements, this is where those become relevant. This includes the patient notification of their education and enrollment, as well as the delivery of patient education and enrollment. Those could be done using prior authorizations, PBM and hubs, medication therapy management systems, telemedicine, patient portals that are managed by the health systems, as well as prior authorization. And then verification that education enrollment occurred could also happen via a prescribing and physician credentialing system or PDMP state databases if it's opioid analgesic medication. Changing gears real quick to monitoring. REMS-specific monitoring has relevance at various points in time, at baseline, acutely, routinely, and throughout therapy, maybe 2 to 3 years out. REMS-specific, so notification of monitoring could be delivered through automated dispensing cabinets, notification within a hospital, EHR drug data feeds, pharmacy dispensing systems, and then delivery of the monitoring could occur via chronic care management, clinical decision support tools, infusion pump guardrails, and laboratory systems. So today I discussed several IT platforms whose services may be expanded to manage national REM activities, but whose integration efforts may be ultimately limited by the lack of financial ROI to justify the important changes. Lastly, there are several technical, I think, nuances that the SBL should consider. One of those is multi-source products. I don't have time to get into that at the moment. But then in closing, is the goal of the REMS is to ensure that the patient is protected throughout their healthcare journey from pre-baseline to prescribing through chronic care management, and that appropriate SPL output at the right time and the right place is critical to the success of this goal.
Great. Thanks, Marie, for covering a lot in a short time. I think probably a lot of people are here familiar with the term ATASU, so that's REMS that are sort of have more required elements. They're elements that are required by providers for safe use, and I appreciate going through the technical details there as well as highlighting the need for a linked financial return on investment. Next, Roger.
Yeah, good morning. Roger Pinsino from Gemini Health. Adam, thanks for teeing up the conversation because it's perfect with the comments I wanted to make. But going back to something you said, and I know that Michelle's going to just talk about it too, but you know, the industry came together a number of years ago, collaborated on a REMS program, and now I hear terminology like model program. And I think to to where I want to make a few comments, I have to explain to the group why that is a program, that is a model program. One is because we are leveraging industry standards. So it's based on the NCPDP telecom standard, 4 billion plus prescriptions filled in ambulatory pharmacy, 90% plus are electronically transacted using that one standard. You're leveraging the technology of the industry, so you're making this a very cost-effective solution for the industry. So number one is sort of the industry adoption there. Another concept that's really important, and I think it's going to relate to what happens in the prescriber space too, is that pharmacies aren't like most businesses. Pharmacies, they don't provide pharmacy care until they electronically transact a prescription order. That's a really important concept. You don't go to a restaurant, pay for your bill, and then have your dinner. Pharmacy is different. We do everything electronically before we provide pharmaceutical care. That's an important concept. I think that will play out in the physician side too. The other reason why it's a model program really is you have essentially one set of business rules within the existing REMS program for all medications. For all pharmacies, rather. So essentially, if you have 60,000 pharmacies in the United States, it's a round number, you're applying these rules against every single pharmacy in the United States for every single drug within a category. That makes it hugely cost-effective and scalable, and you don't have to distribute rules to 60,000 participants. The other thing, too, is, and I'll speed this up a little, is what's happened in pharmacy is it's an interactive conversation. So when you look at what pharmacies do and when they push send and that electronic transaction leaves there are messages coming back to the pharmacy. And it's not really a one out, one back. Very frequently it's one out, one back, one out, one back, and it's a conversation with the person operating the pharmacy practice management system. And that's a huge concept that will ultimately, I think, be important on the prescriber side. And the other thing I want to just point out is it's exception-based. So if you look at 4 billion prescriptions, and if all 4 billion come through one solution, and you can look at every single transaction, then you're only applying messages when and if necessary. And those 100,000 plus pharmacies, those 100,000 plus pharmacy technicians don't have to remember all these business rules. It's all transacted electronically. And the reason that I digress to talk about that model program is because I think there's something going on within NCPDP. And within NCPDP, there are a number of different initiatives around standards. And one of them has to do with, I will describe one of them, is the real-time prescription benefit inquiry transaction. It's very much like what goes on in pharmacy. It's going to be an interactive transaction. It's going to be intended to be when the physician is with the patient, and it will be interactive. And it's going to intend to leverage scale. I think that's going to be important too. And I think the other important point is it's going to be a financial transaction, but it's also going to be a clinical transaction, just like pharmacy does right now. It's a financial transaction, and I think Mark referred to it as a billing transaction, but it delivers clinical information to the pharmacy in real time too. And I think the last thing on that one is, I don't know what transaction standard that will be. I think I heard earlier that the EPA transaction is very conversational in nature, and I totally agree with that. But I don't know that this can piggyback on top of that one, because I think that's exception-based. I think REMS transactions are exception-based. This could be real-time prescription benefit inquiry, or the question will be which standard will it follow, though. But I think it does have to piggyback on another transaction and be exception-based. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Roger. Paul?
Hi. So I'm Paul Sheehan. I head up the REMS department at Celgene Corporation, which is a global biopharma company. We have 3 products approved with a REMS program. Each of these have significant ATARSUs. So it's great that we're having this conversation today with a wide community talking about how better to implement REMS and put it further down within the health IT system, because it's something that we at Celgene think about often. When we think of innovation, there are certainly things that we can do, and there's certainly things that Celgene has done over the last few years, but there are some challenges, and I just wanted to highlight a few of those first. And I think we need to recognize that REMS products with ATARSUs are about 35, which is a very small percentage of the total number of products that will be dispensed in the US each year. So how do we accept that challenge and motivate and encourage the health IT vendors who have lots of other conflicting interests to adopt the technical standards we're talking about today? So that's one thing that we need to work through. Secondly, I think we all recognize that health IT is changing tremendously. There's new innovators coming on board. There's large IT organizations who have previously not done anything in healthcare, looking at the healthcare market nowadays. And there's new approaches that are coming on board. So I'm always thinking about how does the new FHIR standard play in this world? Are we going to be executing the transactional standards that we are today for forevermore? And then I'm glad that Adam talked about this slightly, which is around how are we going to learn from each other? How are we going to maintain all of the health IT standards that we're talking about? And how do we pilot them? How do we learn and fail and improve and pilot these ideas? So within Celgene, let me just explain 3 things that we've done over the last few years. So as we're a REMS sponsor, we're also, I think, uniquely a REMS administrator. I think we're the only pharma company that does it internally. And what we do have, though, which is similar to all of our REMS colleagues, is a website where people can do transactional REMS tasks. We've changed it over the last few years to include a lot more workflow elements within it, recognizing that healthcare within the prescriber and the pharmacy office is a team activity. So we had to introduce some workflow capability. So as we're thinking about how to advance and innovate within this space, I think we have to accept and understand that the prescriber who might be writing the script is then going to be delegating particular tasks for REMS transactions to some of their colleagues. The other thing that we've done recently is we introduced the first REMS transactional mobile app. It mimics our website, but it of course allows a lot more portability in the healthcare setting to do the task. We're still learning how people are adopting that, and look forward to sharing more information on that. We're also thinking about the B2B idea. So how do we directly integrate our REMS processes with particular large EHRs or pharmacy systems, etc.? We know that this works. We know that customers are really interested in these transactional REMS technical solutions. And we've had dramatic uptake of these ideas and concepts that we've released. And a colleague of mine will be talking at the DIA conference later this month to provide some data about utilization of these channels and how really the REMS burden can be addressed by looking at using these innovative technologies. There was a lot of talk earlier on about how REMS could really be innovative by piggybacking on some of the existing work within healthcare. So when I think of the innovation, it's less on the technology side. I think we can do the standards development. That's not overwhelming, but it's the adoption aspect. So how do we possibly look at the REMS data and say, could this support some of the CMS quality measures initiatives? How do we ensure that our activities are completely aligned with the ONC 10-year interoperability roadmap? Are there ways in which we can pull out data that's going to flow through the healthcare system that's going to be required for track and trace and serialization in the future? So for me, the innovation here is less around the technical implementation and the standards, but it's going to be utilizing the other government initiatives, reusing them for REMS purposes, and then hopefully accelerating adoption of our REMS activities because we're piggybacking on those tasks.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. Next is Annette.
Thank you. I'd first like to say I appreciate very much being invited to participate in this conference. UBC has been involved in risk management for many years, from the performance-linked access system and risk map days through the current evolution of REMS. So what I wanted to talk about is that any innovation or change in REMS design and implementation with a common REMS platform must take into account all the ways that patients receive prescriptions. It's not just dispensing through a retail pharmacy, which seems to be the focus of some of the innovations that are being proposed that is using the switch technology. Current switch technology, while it does provide relatively seamless method for safety adjudication, is intentionally limited by contracts and agreements. Further, less than half of the products which have REMS with elements to assure safe use are dispensed through retail pharmacies where switches are relied upon for claims adjudication. We need to think about another dimension of the stakeholder groups. We can't neglect products that are developed or that are dispensed by a specialty pharmacy, a closed network healthcare system, or which have a specialty distributor that fills orders from a buy and bill prescriber, a hospital, a long-term care facility, or another kind of institution. Many specialty pharmacies do not rely on switch technology for all their claims adjudications, whether because they provide prescriptions for their own members or they're smaller independent pharmacies that have direct connections to major payers. When a specialty distributor is involved, they may need to determine if the order was placed by a REMS-enrolled entity, but it's an institution itself that may need to verify that other REMS requirements are met. Any innovations in REMS implementation must also take advantage of current and future technologies, exactly what we're talking about here, such as e-prescribing and mobile apps that Paul just mentioned for adjudicating REMS requirements. Bringing REMS requirements to the prescriber rather than through the intermediary pharmacy. This is certainly something that Adam's also discussed, and I think the intent of a lot of the conference today, and I think the ones that you're planning for the future. An effective configuration might be an open system standard that houses the adjudication results, that is, the knowledge that a prescriber's enrolled or a patient's enrolled or a lab test has been done, whatever the REMS requirement happens to be. The REMS administrator would remain responsible for collecting and verifying the data that's included in the open system. This is really a variation, I think, on the common REMS platform that's being described today, and it may be close to what Adam just called standardization with customization. In this scenario, the REMS implementation can be agnostic to one or more switches, specialty pharmacies, specialty distributors, and e-prescribing clearinghouses, all of which would access the open system to confirm REMS eligibility. Whichever technology or technologies are most appropriate for the product, the healthcare setting, and the patient population being served can be used without concern that additional processes would be needed for REMS adjudication. Also, I'd like to comment a little bit on unintended consequences of attempting to standardize every aspect of a REMS. And I know that this, again, is being taken into account by this audience and by the activities that we're going to be talking about. But for instance, there's a recent trend in REMS design that seems a little contrary to the REMS goal of reducing burden to the healthcare system. A high percentage of REMS with elements to assure safe use involve medications to treat rare or orphan conditions. Traditionally, sponsors provide support services to these patients during the course of dispensing the product. For example, some of the REMS enrollment forms included the prescription or collect other details needed for patient support that are outside of the REMS. In an effort to standardize REMS, FDA is starting to separate the REMS data for some of the traditional patient support activities provided by, for instance, a specialty pharmacy or a hub if there are multiple specialty pharmacies, or by some other means. The intent of bundling REMS data collection and other services was to have a single transparent system to reduce the paperwork and transactional burden to patients and prescribers. The intent was also to avoid delays in therapy for all patients who were generally very ill. Now processes are being revised to separate these services from REMS requirements, which could add to additional paperwork and time before the patient receives their medication. I look forward to participating in the next steps as we develop or evolve REMS that fit into the evolving healthcare system and effectively reduce risk.
Great. Thanks very much, Annette. Katie?
Yes,
Very good.
okay, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for the invitation to come and present and to keep in mind the end.
No, we're not good. Sorry.
Is it on?
There you go.
Thank you for the invitation to participate in this workshop and to keep the end user or clinical perspective in focus in regards to the REMS Common Platform. The platform can be a challenge for the inpatient setting since we like to think of the electronic health record as being more of a closed system and doesn't necessarily communicate with the switch. Utilizing the SPL to incorporate information at the appropriate step in the medication process may be a benefit, but it's also important to note that not all of the same ETASUs that apply to the outpatient setting also apply to the inpatient setting, and not all the information may be relevant for every drug order. And so one of the concerns with healthcare providers that could lead to things is as alert fatigue. In regards to the EHR, there are a lot of homegrown systems and alerts that have been created in the hospital setting, and this is these systems have actually identified where the relevant REMS information needs to be distributed throughout that medication process. There's also many technologies in the hospital used by various disciplines that do communicate with the EHR, and we can probably look at these to utilize or see how they work, as these also coincide where REMS information needs to be displayed to the healthcare provider. Some of the systems that are used on a daily basis, and this is more of a general statement, are the medication dispensing cabinets, are pumps for IV administration, point of care testing, lab systems, our radiology systems, the EMR, all the drug information systems that do provide that SPL language, and then barcode medication administration. So there are those two-way communications that we utilize. The EHR can then be thought of as the final place of information to document all the systems that different departments use. So REMS Common Platform that had this capability would be beneficial in providing real-time information and possibly decreasing workload and duplicate work. The challenge with the coordination of care in the inpatient setting and the transition of care is that the physician caring for the patient is often not really the primary care physician. This physician usually you can think of is the intern and is not aware of the REMS requirements. In other words, the simple continuation of a patient's home medication, which would usually take 1 to 5 minutes to verify and dispense and administer, could take 1 to 10 hours. So the time for verification and coordination of patient enrollment and safe use conditions can cause delays in patient therapy, increase in patient workload or duplicate work, as well as increased patient and healthcare provider frustration because the normal medication administration process is no longer in place. So this is where that common platform, when and if integrated into the EHR, would really help with the medication process. It'd be able to provide real-time information to determine which portions of the ETASUs need completed. Really, we need to determine where the system needs to incorporate that information. When you think about an inpatient setting, the pharmacist tends to be that gatekeeper with the verification of the ETASUs. In the outpatient setting, it's the nurse in the primary care group that usually takes that role. With the platform, this could probably alleviate some of that work, and I believe most healthcare providers would be interested in helping with this development. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you all for comments on a wide-ranging set of issues and opportunities relating to innovation to bring this common platform into more widespread use. Many of you talked about some of the challenges in integrating this with existing workflows and practices for a very diverse set of drugs and patient populations and prescribing settings. And I do want to discuss that a little bit further, but first I want to go back to several of you talked about technical standards and gaps, Marie, others. But I think the general consensus was that there are not a lot of technical obstacles here. Let me push you all on that. Is that that's not where we ought to be focusing our attention? Really, it's about getting use cases that can connect existing technical standards and mechanisms to solving practical problems in REMS implementation. And I'm looking at you because I know you talked about some of the technical gaps here as well, but any comments that you all would like to make about important technical standards issues that do need to be addressed here?
Mark, I think that's an important point, and we have to start at a starting point. And one of the things that we find in adoption of technical cases, or even health IT, is we have to have some type of standardization in order to communicate between entities. And this is the important piece that I believe that the REMS platform will help with. By standardizing not only the discrete data, but also some of the format of how that can be incorporated within electronic health records, and then even be prepared to exchange and be shared among the healthcare team, is an important aspect. Because we have to get back to who is important. We can do a checkbox that the prescriber has done this, and we can do a checkbox that the pharmacist has done that, and that the pharmaceutical manufacturer has done this particular aspect of it. And that's where the technology can really help. But let's get back to what's really happening, and what's really important is the care of our patients. And that communication of what that medication is going to do with that patient, how those adverse events are going to be documented, and how that information is going to be shared within the healthcare team. And in order to do that, you have to start at a common platform. And I believe that that's what this will do.
Any other comments on this topic?
Yeah, so I generally believe that business needs drive standards. So to answer your question, I don't think technically it's trivial, but I think the business side of it and the complexities of creating revenue models, cost models are going to drive the technology requirements.
Marie, any particular gaps that you found in your analysis that relate to key technical standards issues that you'd really want to highlight?
Well, I think it's early to tell if the current existing standards are able to comprehensively manage all the various aspects of the safety parameters for each ATASU medication from start to finish, because they're just quite very comprehensive. So you have everything from, if you have a patient who starts on a medication today and they continue on that medication chronically for 3 to 5 years, you're following that patient regardless of setting, and there are the measures that happen even before the patient enters the picture. I looked at, for the purpose of today's presentation, looked at 23 existing systems. And what was interesting is that really largely none of those systems on a vendor level have incorporated REMS to any great extent. And I do agree that if you cannot produce a good ROI picture for that, then it's going to be a little bit challenging. But if it's part of a meaningful use, or it is part of the FHIR standard or other aspect of the higher level of EHR certifications and incorporated into other national standards, that hospitals and health systems will push for that level of safety, and they'll push for that level of quality, and then the vendors will do it. But if the client, meaning the healthcare systems, if they're not asking for it in a meaningful way, it's just not, it's low down on the list. So.
Well, let's now turn to that financial ROI, which I think several of you have mentioned, that REMS, especially the ATASU REMS, those involving actions that providers have to take, apply to only a small number of drugs out of the universe. Some of them are for rare populations. Is there a clear pathway, or what's needed to get to that clear pathway for financial ROI, for getting these systems, getting this common platform incorporated into commonly used health IT systems? Paul, I think you talked about this issue as being a particular challenge. I think we could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So we've had early conversations with a number of EMR vendors to talk to them about, okay, we can go off and create the standards through NCPDP, but what will it take for you to implement that standard within your platform? They have a lot of competing priorities, both regulatory government ones as well as customer requests. And the answer given to us is really, well, it's going to be an advocacy effort. They will respond more favorably if their customers are saying this is a request that they want it to be met. So as well as creating the standard, we need to consider what education and advocacy efforts can be brought to ensure that the standard is adopted.
Other comments on this? Yeah, go ahead.
Along the same line, when you look at return on investment, it's important that we look at our prescribers and our providers of care in the usability of their systems. This is a big piece of what I think you're talking about, is how do we work within the workflow of those providers? And as standards development organizations, we need to be aware of what can we utilize and how can we bring those standards to make that return on investment to the providers within their own workflow systems. We can't sort of force them to say, you know, through a regulatory process or through a quality measure process to say, you will do this. It's a tool that works, but if we really want to be effective, we have to look at the usability of how they're using that system and make the standards work for those providers.
Yeah, I mean, I get the comment about sort of hearing about, well, you know, you get people need to advocate to us the IT vendors and IT providers in order for this to be a priority. Advocacy, though, effective advocacy is usually driven by something really concrete, like, as I think you were just saying, a demonstration of reduced burdens, of better workflows, and meaningfully better efficiencies in care and reduced workflows. Also potentially by links to other broader policy initiatives. I think several of you brought up the changing nature of, say, meaningful use incentives and the steps that ONC is implementing more broadly around the roadmap to interoperability. Maybe we could take each of those in turn. Any really good examples that you want to highlight that could go into use cases for this common platform around demonstrating the most promising ways to demonstrate a reduced burden, to demonstrate improved workflow for providers. Any that you all would like to highlight? Yeah.
Sure. So I mentioned that we're going to be delivering an oral poster at the DIA conference at the end of this month in Philly, I think it is, and it talks about the time it takes to complete REMS, our REMS transactions across the different channels. So it examines if you did a prescriber enrollment online versus if you did it by contacting our call center and faxing it in. And what we found through the research is if you did it online, it takes just under 2 minutes. If you did it using the fax method and talking to humans, it takes upwards of 25. And that is those time efficiency gains, which for some it equates to the burden question. I think that you see those gains throughout all of the different REMS activities, whether it's patient enrollment, whether it's surveys, whether it's a pharmacy dispense task. So yes, there's some absolute ROI burden type value to had from embracing this technology, and you could foresee that by using the REMS platform standards, those would be maintained as well.
Other examples any of you would like to highlight? Areas to focus on as this common platform development moves forward?
I'll take a stab at it. I really think, with everything, marketability of why you're doing something is very important. If people, the REMS SPL project is really going to play a huge role in the success of implementing REMS, but why do we want to implement REMS? Really to ensure that when high-risk drugs are used and made available, that the patients don't have harm. But the buzzword for all of that in the healthcare industry and where hospitals and everyone is pushing is been marketed more so as clinical decision support. And clinical decision support is all about intelligent medication decision making, where when you look at drug-drug interaction checking today, it's looking at drug-to-drug interactions and drug-to-allergy interactions. But the REMS SPL will allow us to look much more broadly. It allows you to look at things like drug-to-comorbidity, drug to family history, drug to laboratory result, drug to end organ function, where if you think about the economics of the safety implications of what that can do long term, you're able to justify, I think, a much bigger important safety measure for healthcare drug use safety and quality nationally and globally that folks are maybe underappreciating now or don't recognize. So I think marketing the SPL in a way that it's going to support clinical decision support of technology systems is a good way to put it in relatable terms for people who may not truly grasp what REMS is all about.
I'm just wondering if in the pilot that's been going on, whether some of that, either the old-fashioned time and motion kinds of things that Paul mentioned, or some of the more intangible but really important patient outcomes kinds of things that Marie talked about will be included, because I think that in the pilot that will be the way we're going to learn about those things and really be able to then model it.
And just to pick up on that point, so we've talked about implications of this program for workload burden and the like. But as you said, the ultimate goal really is better patient outcomes as well as avoiding unnecessary costs. And I think a lot of people have viewed IT issues like this one as maybe playing out in new healthcare policies around meaningful use, and in the recently proposed CMS macro regulation, the emphasis on practical meaningful use measures that really do reflect data being exchanged in a way that can improve care. But really the main focus of all of these payment reform efforts is on linking payments more directly to outcomes, given that this platform could be another tool to get to better measurement, better tracking of how patients are doing, and potentially measurement of outcomes. Do you see a link there in terms of creating the business case and getting ROI on these steps towards a common platform? Any comments on that? Yeah.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that one. And this is an area that we focused on quite extensively for not only pharmacists, but all healthcare providers in moving towards meeting some of those alternative payment models for value. And one of the areas that is important that we've been working with the Office of the National Coordinator on is the adoption of the electronic care plan, which goes back to what I said in the beginning, is how do we actually share this information, because it's really important information. It's not just doing a checkbox that I did this function of talking to the patient about the risks, but it's now, did that patient really understand that? Is it in usable terms for that patient? Having a way to capture some of that information in a discrete way and being able to share it and leveraging the standards to do that is the key, because then you can do the quality measures on the backside. If you go back to the PCAST report, the President's Council of Advisors of Science and Technology in 2010, that stated that our systems should be providing information, and as providers, we should be documenting within our systems, and then we should be able to pull that information out of the system, and it shouldn't be the other way around. And I believe that that's where we need to go for meeting those alternative payment models. We have to have better clinical documentation using discrete data that's embedded into some of the platforms like the REMS platform, using things like RxNorm and SNOMED CT that will be able to capture some of that clinical aspect in a discrete way so that we can do the quality measures, measure the outcomes in order to meet those alternative payment models.
Other comments on this? Yes.
I just wanted to, again, make a caveat that remember, and Terry mentioned this, that REMS is only focusing on certain risks of a product, not all the risks. So outcomes are dependent on not only those particular ones that we're focused on, the REMS, but something much broader. So we have to also rein in our ideals a little bit to think about, well, what improving the REMS kinds of things and
where
the
does this fit
data
in?
may not necessarily change other kinds of outcomes. So.
Other comments on this topic?
I meant to say in the last comment, another buzzword is precision medicine. So REMS the way in which these medications, the new expectation or the accountability for if you prescribe or if you administer or if you dispense these medications, that they need to be done so or carried out using this fashion that has been laid forth in the program. And that is, it's very precise. It's precision medicine. It's clinical decision support. So, and agree that being able to pull that information out and put it in the electronic structured documents so that it can be part of it maintains throughout as part of the chronic care management of the patient as well, because these
Great.
are chronic patients.
Great. I'd like to open this up to comments and questions from the audience. So again, the microphones are on the table, and if you do have any comments or questions about the topic, let me know. See in the back.
I think it works. I just wanted to say thank you. Very interesting talk. My office kept me, so I arrived a little bit late. My name is Monica Dorhai, and I currently work with the World Bank, but I also I'm Vice President Risk. I work for the board, and I work in about 35 countries, but I'm also ambassador for American Diabetes Association. I'm a huge supporter. So I'm a huge supporter of Duke. Huge supporter. So I want to say thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Other questions, comments? Yes. Give it a second. There you go.
All right, sorry. My name is Barbara Kornblein with HealthQ2, and I was wondering, Dr. McClellan, when you're talking about, you seem to be alluding to pay for performance. So I'm wondering, what is the quality measure, or what's the outcome that you expect from use of the REMS?
Yeah, let's ask the panel that. So we had a little bit of discussion that a minute ago, noting that REMS are really about some particular known and potential risks, not about all of the risks and all the benefits of treatment that might influence a patient's outcomes. So given that there is this big push towards alternative payment models taking place, and that's what the electronic system supporting healthcare are intended to improve, this shift towards more of a focus on value and outcomes. How does REMS really fit into that? It's not the whole picture, but it seems like it could be an important element, at least for certain kinds of patients. Yeah.
Definitely, and I think as we move forward into really a more person-centric type of model, which is what we're going to, and not necessarily coming up with a care plan as we would decide as a provider what a care plan is, but really looking at the patient as a plan of health. Where does that patient really engage in that care? So if we look at REMS and we look at the health concerns and we look at the interventions that are out there that the provider can work, we come up with a plan for that patient to devise goals that would be related to REMS. So if a patient is on this high-risk medication, what does the patient need to look for? What adverse events does that patient need to make sure is being communicated? And that aspect of the goals are then captured so that you can say from a quality standpoint that the care has actually, the care with that provider and the care that has been given to that patient has actually had positive outcomes. Now, some of those outcomes might be negative, but then you have a plan to move towards positive outcomes. What we have in healthcare today is very episodic. What we're looking for is a much more longitudinal look at that patient in a very person-centric way. And then moving away from just a quality measure to say that I did a REMS evaluation on this patient, you now begin to say that the REMS aspect of what you've done with that provider and the outcomes that have come up with it has now had a quality portion to the care of that patient and the health of that patient and the life of that patient.
Yeah, so I would like to sort of tag on to that goes perfect. But the way I sort of look at REMS now is it seems to be very episodic. In other words, it's a prescribing event, do this. It's a dispensing event, do this. But to use, sort of Shelley's vernacular is, it seems to me REMS as a tool set needs to evolve to look at a patient longitudinally. What happens outside of those episodic events of prescribing or dispensing? And I think that's a huge area of opportunity for, FDA and all of us as developing these programs, to look at a patient more longitudinally.
Well, let me just push it back to where we started. So, I mean, clearly this push towards a longitudinal view of a patient is important, but as you all have emphasized, REMS is a piece of that. And getting back to the core goal here, which is what is it going to take to make this common REMS platform successful? Clearly, it's becoming a more integrated part of this overall shift towards longitudinal patient management, effectively. But could we go back to maybe some of the other financial ROI motivators? Is this overall longitudinal goal an important part, a major part of what we should be focusing on? Or are there some more proximal issues around things like just reducing the burden of REMS compliance?
I don't think you can.
They're not contradictory. Yeah.
I jumped in there. So it's like anything else. There's sort of an upside or downside to any of these sort of decisions, right? And I think nobody's prepared to do things that are going to escalate the cost of healthcare in the system today. And so I think you have to make decisions based on, is this going to drive healthcare costs up, or is it going to drive down? So I would say, yeah, you have to consider the financial consequences of any of these decisions.
Other questions? Yeah, Paul.
Hi, Paul Seligman from Amgen. Marie, I wanted to follow up on a comment you made about clinical decision support and the sort of traditional use of sort of looking at allergies and co-medication, but the fact that they could actually easily be extended to look at things like laboratory testing or the indication, et cetera. I was curious as to whether there are any sort of impediments to that extension, or why healthcare institutions sort of naturally aren't sort of adopting these other elements into their clinical support systems.
Well, it's a change in business model, quite frankly. Healthcare systems do implement facility level and system level clinical decision support through protocols and order sets that are largely driven and condoned by or approved by the division that specialty. So if it's for neurology or rheumatology. So you do see it, but it's not happening necessarily at a vendor level to that extent.
And just a follow-up question. I'm curious to the degree to which organizations that accredit hospitals or outpatient clinics actually look at decision support systems as a measure of the quality of care that institutions are providing, and whether there might be an opportunity there to have some sort of broader influence on sort of the adoption of some of these data standards that we're talking about today. It's not necessarily for you, Marie, but for others on the panel.
Well, there's an initial upfront investment, and I think that's what you were saying, Roger, by the facility to have the long-term benefit and gain. But it's going to take a while for them to recoup that investment. But if there is plenty of literature and data that supports that outcome. If you're looking at value-based purchasing, that outcome is optimized when a specialist is managing a patient versus a generalist who crosses all boundaries. And I would think you could get consensus from a cardiologist to say, if they were to look at a REMS, a TASU program for a specific cardiac agent, that they're going to give you the thumbs up of, yes, this is all important stuff. This all should happen. This is how the patient should be managed. And why? Because you achieve a better outcome, a superior outcome, and therefore you reduce costs and you improve quality. But if you, so So because REMS, each program is specific to a given agent, I think one way to help with that ROI justification and the benefit of why we need to do those things is to showcase them in, if you follow this model and this is the cost of the untoward side effects, that you could reduce your cost of care across, you know, your patient population by X, that's going to help justify some of that.
And again, that's not something that the REMS programs by themselves are going to do, but they need to fit into this general push towards, more, as you said, more system-wide clinical pathways or decision support programs for particular kinds of patients.
Correct, and to utilize outside models to set the example for why that's important.
Yeah, just wondering in terms of focusing the efforts here around the common platform, I just want to make sure that you all think that the technical side, the standards issues are going to be relatively straightforward, and that it really is going to be a matter of making clear to IT vendors, the broader community, that these REMS tools, if used, this platform, if used effectively, can help achieve a broad range of goals around reducing costs and improving patient outcomes.
So yes, I think we're blessed in trying to solve this REMS technical standard problem by having so many standards by very mature groups that are available to be used already.
Okay. Yes. Time for one more question, I think.
Jeff Chalmers from the Cleveland Clinic. I've managed a team that deals mostly with inpatient EMRs, and I guess I agree that from the ambulatory perspective, there's a lot of very mature standards that once the common REMS platform standards are in place, could be leveraged very fairly cleanly and easily. But on the inpatient side, inpatient EMR, the medication use cycle is much more contained. There's a lot fewer calls out to external databases to get information than there is on the ambulatory side. So I guess I would anticipate maybe a little more challenges on the inpatient side than ambulatory, because there's not a lot of that infrastructure in place that's being leveraged for other things today. We develop things sometimes, but that's all institution specific. We're not leveraging existing standards.
Yeah. Comments on that? Yeah.
And that's a perfect example of where we're going to in future aspects of exchange of clinical information, that it can't just stay in the four walls of the hospital or within the seemingly walls of a health system, that we need to begin to share that information as that patient moves longitudinally from one practice setting to the other, that you shouldn't be redoing information related to REMS just because it happened in one site. So I agree with you that it's going to be a heavy lift for some of the institutional settings, long-term care, for hospitals, but we have to get to that point where we're going to be sharing the information. This is where the HL7 standards come in for electronic structured documents, where we will be able to share that information from one healthcare provider to the other. And I think that that's an important piece of where we will see the value back to how some of these systems are developed. But when we look at the REMS platform, we're looking at the first phase. We're looking at the phase of standardization of one aspect of this. And it's going to take us several steps and several phases to get us to that nirvana point where we're evenly sharing information and data is flowing freely.
Any other final comments from the panel? All right, well, we may not be at nirvana yet, but thank you all for a very good discussion on some practical next steps to get there through the Common REMS platform. Thank you all very much. All right. We're now going to take a 15-minute break. We'll reconvene here at 11 o'clock for our next session on leveraging existing data standards, as this group highlighted, and also leveraging partnerships to facilitate the development and implementation of a common REMS platform.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started for our next session. If you could please take your seats. Adam. So I'll just sit down while Michelle presents. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, because there's nowhere in here that says. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started on our next session. Well, no.
No, okay.
And you are? I just want to know who the... Okay, there
So
you
I
are.
follow
Yeah,
Michelle.
yeah, great. And Michelle, you can probably sit in the second one. I'm going to sit here while you're talking. Any order's fine. I'd like to go ahead and invite our panelists for the next session to join me up on the stage. Okay, before the break, we heard from panelists in the first session about the potential tools and health IT systems that could be leveraged to support a common REMS platform. We also heard a lot about standards. So standard is definitely an important topic, and moving standards forward, existing or at least identifying gaps where new standards are needed, is an important discussion to have. So we're going to continue that discussion with this next session. We'll learn about some of the potential standards that could be leveraged to enable the platform's goals, as well as some discussion about how we might facilitate collaboration. So another thing that came up on the earlier session is it's not just talking about standards and how to move them forward, but potentially collaborations or examples of collaborative models that can really help improve the uptake and utilization of a standard. So we will be talking a lot about that on this next session. To kick off this session, we're going to hear from Michelle Davidson, who is Manager of Pharmacy Technical Standards Development and Policy at Walgreens and past Board of Trustees Chair at the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, or NCPDP. Michelle's going to give a brief presentation, and I think you do have slides, is that right? So I'll invite you up to the podium. After that presentation from Michelle, then we're going to turn right into the rest of our panelists who have a few minutes of prepared comments. So that will include Gerald McAvoy, Assistant Vice President at HFS Drug Information, American Society for Health System Pharmacists, Scott Robertson, Principal Technology Consultant at Kaiser Permanente and Fellow at Health Level 7 International, Mark Overhage, Chief Health Informatics Officer at Cerner, Kelly Weigel, Vice President of REMS Business Development at McKesson, and then finally Andrew Gettinger, Chief Medical Information Officer and Executive Director of the Office of Clinical Quality and Safety at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technologies. We have a lot of great comments from Andy. So to kick off this session, I'll turn it over to Michelle. There's the clicker there.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of the NCPDP standards in risk, the REMS. I'll just say REMS. Everybody here knows what REMS is. So we've determined what it's not today. And we've already, fortunately, Adam and others have given you a little bit of background. You don't need my bio and disclosure about some of the uses of the NCPDP standards. I'm going to explain a little bit about NCPDP and the use of our transaction, minimizing the burden of the REMS, and our different standards, which are the billing standard, which is the telecom standard, and the e-prescribing or the script standard. NCPDP, for those who are not familiar with our organization, is a multi-stakeholder problem-solving forum for the healthcare industry. We are ANSI accredited, and our main two standards which are named in regulation, are the NCPDP telecom standard, or the billing standard, which is named in HIPAA, and the e-prescribing standard, which is the script standard, and that's named in the MMA regulation. This is a diagram. I'm not going to go through that, but it is also in one of your handouts. But this is a great diagram that shows the use of several different standards in the whole prescribing process, from the delivery of, actually from the time a patient goes into the doctor's office to the time they get their medication. And this includes a whole plethora of standards, from the X12 standards, the e-prescribing standard, the billing standard, and this is just the way standards are used in the delivery of health care with the patient. So this will kind of sets the tone for the whole REMS process. So minimizing the burden of REMS through standardization. And this is really important as far as NCPDP. There are two different standards that we have. One, that the telecom standard is currently implemented and is being used by pharmacies. As you heard today, Roger did a very good job of explaining its use in the billing standard. Great example of the current process is the turf REMS, and we've actually published a solution for prescribers using the script standard, and I'm going to go into probably too much detail for some people in this room, but going to explain it later. So first we'll talk about the telecom billing standard. And this is a diagram that actually explains prescriber and dispenser workflow, which, when you're talking about standardization of any type of process, the first thing you have to consider is the whole workflow. And we looked at workflow from the very beginning of the time that the prescriber looks at the prescription, including, their requirements, which means CE, enrollment, education of the patient, and delivery of the prescription to the patient onto where it's sent to the patient electronically. And we're talking NCPDP standards, and then dispensing the prescription to the pharmacy. And our goal is to maximize patient access, including making sure that we want to include efficiency and satisfy all the DEA or the FDA requirements, and also minimize cost. We heard a lot of that in the previous panel today, and we also want to make sure that we don't disrupt burden or workflow, and we want to make sure that we decrease burden, right? That's very important when you're talking about standardization. So as NCPDP, when we looked at producing standards and introducing the standardized process, these were all the different factors that we took into consideration. So key challenges for the pharmacy perspective was we had to develop a program that met all of the FDA requirements, and we had to successfully engage all the pharmacies and deliver some kind of registration and compliance process. But we had to use existing technologies. Very, very important. And Roger touched on that. The current telecom claims process is used by all the retail pharmacies. Every single claim is billed in a pharmacy electronically. So that was a no-brainer for us from NCPDP standpoint. And then we thought we could check eligibility, we could check all the different requirements. And we had to minimize workflow because we can't increase the burden on the pharmacies. So that's very important. And then we also wanted to integrate it with the billing process, so we added it to the point of dispense. We successfully also wanted to engage prescribers, and when we looked at our solution for e-prescribing, that was key too. And when we talk to prescribers on that solution, not only do we want their process to be engaging with them, but it also has to have patient access and also use the current standards. So in the pharmacy transaction, this is a little bigger diagram than what you saw with Roger, and we piggyback this on the claim where we have the pharmacy and the switch and the processor. And I'm going to skip through this real quick because Roger talked to you about that, because I want to get into the e-prescribing one. And these are some of the transactions that are used today. Besides TERF, we've got clozapine and others. And we used regular REMS fields that are in practice today that are currently in the pharmacy billing standard. So so we can identify the pharmacy, the product, the prescriber, the pharmacist, and the patient very easily in the pharmacy transaction. So now I want to talk more about the e-prescribing transaction, because that's the new one that hasn't been adopted, but it's been passed. And currently, the challenges to the prescriber are even bigger than the challenges that the pharmacy sees, because the prescription actually originates with the prescriber, and they have even more challenges. The patient has to be enrolled. The prescriber also has to be enrolled and trained. They have to counsel the patient, and they have to prescribe the medication under certain conditions. And if those requirements aren't met, then the patient gets to the pharmacy, and then they can't get their medication. So how do we solve those problems? And that's where we came up with this e-prescribing transaction. And the first thing we did was this transaction is actually triggered by the SPL, which you've heard about. And the way this does is in the EHR, the physician's EHR, it will actually, the SPL will let it know that this is a REMS drug, and it will tell the EHR system that it needs to trigger this e-prescribing transaction, and we call it a REMS initiation request. So it'll say, send a REMS request to the REMS administrator. And if it's for a basic REMS that just basically needs to determine eligibility information, then it would go to the REMS administrator and come back and say, yes, the patient's eligible, the physician's eligible, and the doctor's eligible, and then no other information would be needed, and it could send then a new prescription on to the pharmacy. However, if it's a REMS with ETASU, then it would need additional information, and it would start the Q&A process, which would actually trigger more of an EPA model, which is a different transaction in the NCPDP function. So the EHR would know that the REMS is required by the SPL, and they would use the SPL as a trigger, which is exactly what Adam was referring to when he referred to the SPL trigger earlier. And this is just a more sophisticated model of what I described before. If you look on the one side is the prescriber side, and the other is the REMS administrator, and you've got the transactions going back and forth. And it's going to be a transaction that goes back and forth where, depending on when you get the yes or the no, and it starts as a basic, you're going to send the initial request, and if all goes well, it initially starts as, I have this basic transaction and I need eligibility information. You get all is eligible. It comes back, yes, patient is eligible, physician is eligible, drug is eligible, great. I need more information, yes, no. If you don't need any more information, it will go on to the pharmacy as the REMS is approved. If you need more information, then it's going to send back an additional request, and then the EHR would trigger an electronic prior auth. And this is the same picture, but in more of a picture type of model. For those of you that are from a picture type of that see things, I guess, in a picture world better. It's just going to be the transaction that goes back and forth. And as we have time to answer questions, I can get more technical with those of you who would like. But in a nutshell, that is the transaction, and we can answer your questions, and wish I had more time to describe it. And I hope I didn't confuse you. So.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Okay, thanks for that presentation, Michelle. We're going to jump right into our panel discussion, and I think Jerry, you're next, and you might have some opening comments.
Yes. So the two aspects that I've been asked to comment on as part of this panel, one is kind of briefly discussing why structured product labeling was chosen, and at the end of the day, that's kind of the central standard that's being applied as part of this whole activity for the common platform. And then secondly, some of the challenges that exist in an inpatient environment versus an ambulatory care environment. So briefly, it's been about 6 years now since NCPDP recommended that we explore with FDA the use of structured product labeling as the data standard to be applied for codifying REMS information. At the time, NCPDP was already working on the transaction side of things, and they could have easily chosen to develop their own language and codifying scheme for this, but fortunately they did not. They chose to use an existing standard, and the reason they chose that is because it was an existing standard. It's a highly granular standard. It's one that's very adaptable. It includes both codification of data as well as incorporates content. There's an existing infrastructure to support structured product labeling. Sponsors, drug sponsors are very familiar with structured product labeling, and there are many processes in place, many groups that are involved when using structured product labeling, that it lends itself to improvement over time, for example, that as needs may change over time, it's potentially possible to also change the SPL model to adapt to them. And that's what, in fact, happened with REMS. It was modified to accommodate REMS as part of the SPL standard. Another reason it was chosen is it's an XML standard, and it's an XML standard through HL7. And anyone that uses XML realizes the power that that type of document management or content management provides, in that you can intelligently exchange data about anything, and in this case, specifically about drugs. So briefly, that's the reason why SPL was chosen. That's the reason why FDA accepted it as one of the priority projects under PDUFA 5. The last thing I'll say about SPL is to recognize that it really has great potential moving forward. We're not just limited to how it's being applied today, really as an indexing mechanism with the summary REMS document, but if you think about it in its most expansive application, all of the materials that are not being captured right now through SPL could in the future potentially be captured if the need were in fact supported. So you can imagine all of the information that's buried in those documents that potentially could be useful to capture electronically to drive more intelligent clinical decision support. So as a standard, it really is an important one. So moving on to the context of the two environments we're talking about, what we've heard from people in the audience and people on the previous panel is that the standards that we focused on most specifically are NCPDP standards that are very transaction-based and that are used in an outpatient environment. On the inpatient side, it's HL7 standards that are used. And as someone mentioned earlier, the way that we operate within an institutional environment is much different than the way you operate within an outpatient environment. And there are going to be great challenges, I believe, in ensuring that the information that's needed to flow bidirectionally, whether the patient starts on a REMS drug in an outpatient setting or starts on it in an inpatient setting, will be one of the most important challenges to be faced. But there are things that are occurring in the inpatient setting, in the institutional setting, that really are other challenges that will present opportunities, I think, for solutions along with that. So you think of something like white bagging. A lot of drugs are now coming into hospitals from external sources. So that need to connect to external sources of data is increasing within the institutional environment. The way that 340B drugs are being handled, oftentimes it's being handled on the outpatient side in a community pharmacy, for example. So there are a number of things that are occurring in the environment itself that I'm hopeful will contribute to finding a solution to the challenge of communicating the necessary data that needs to be exchanged in those two environments. And I think Michelle and others have commented on the two points that we're focused on right now is the interplay that occurs between the EHR and e-prescribing. So we already have that interplay occurring between the NCPDP script standard and the repository of data that the EHR represents. And so that presents, I think, an opportunity to be explored further as one of the potential solutions to address this challenge. But there are many others. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. Next, we'll hear from Scott.
Hello. I'm Scott Robertson. I'm with Kaiser Permanente. But I'm not here really to represent Kaiser as much as I have a unique position where I work extensively in multiple standards organizations, NCPDP, HL7, some ISO, just all kinds of acronyms that you don't really want to know. Some people have the opinion that you have to choose a standard and work within that standard, but as Jerry was just pointing out, it doesn't have to be just one organization. When NCPDP started this work, they recognized that FDA had built SPL, and it was a good vehicle to use to extend into the REMS space. So there's a lot of more cooperation between the standards organizations than a lot of people know about. Myself and a handful of others sort of try to manipulate that on both sides so that they work together and they don't conflict. Because with NCPDP, we've gone through a lot of the telecom and script issues. With HL7, we've talked about SPL, which is a CDA. It's a clinical document architecture-based document. But there are other CDAs, and if you are familiar with the various HIE programs and meaningful use, you know of CCDAs, Consolidated Clinical Document Architecture. No, that's not right. It's hard to keep track of them all. It really is. But needless to say, it's specialized clinical information, and that might be something we can leverage as well when a REMS strategy may require detailed clinical information. It could be asking for a document that already exists rather than having to build it all the time. And we've also mentioned things like the X12 standards. One thing that you might have heard mentioned in various venues is FHIR. And I was asked to bring up FHIR, which stands for Fast Healthcare Information Resources. It's a reasonably new standard coming out of HL7. It is still considered a trial standard, so it's not, well, we say not fully baked yet. There are still things that are happening to it. It's evolving, but they're expecting within the next year or so there will be a stable version out to be used. What that does is it takes a lot of the very, very detailed information that HL7 tends to support and puts it in somewhat more business-friendly terms, and then uses primarily APIs to send the information back and forth. And I mention all that because APIs are different than the switch transactions that everybody else has been talking about. So there are ways of using these same elements. FHIR doesn't have to be specifically different than SPL. They can embed SPLs in FHIR. They can embed transactions within FHIR. We can embed SPLs within or CDA documents within the script standard. There's a lot of ways of making these standards work together. And then it's not just about HL7 and NCPDP. We have vocabulary standards, SNOMED, ICD-10, ICD-11. Yeah, you don't want to hear about that. RX norm, LOINC, there's a whole mess of those things. Really what it all comes down to in standards terms is development of an implementation guide. How can you use the various standards for what they are good for and meld them all together into the business solution that you need? By using these standards, you end up with a modular set of information that you can build predictably and extend functionally. So that's all the standard stuff, but not really. There's also transport standards, which we're not really dealing with here, but I'm going to point out because EHRs, pharmacies, PHRs, the patient's health record systems, they all can talk to each other through health information exchanges. And there's no reason why we might potentially leverage those same health information exchanges and those technologies to facilitate the REMS operations. So there's what we've been talking about, a lot of data standards. There are some workflow transactional and communication standards that can be leveraged as well. And I think I am about ready to be told that I'm out of time.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Lots of acronyms. Thank you for bringing all of those up.
I can explain most of them.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll ask you to do some of that. So I turn it over to Mark.
Thanks very much. That was a perfect setup. Thank you very much. So I'm Mark Overhage. I'm with Cerner Corporation now. I spent 25 years in academia, though, and was involved in the development of many of these standards, HL7 and LOINC and things like that. So I'm a standards lover. But I'm even more passionate about standards adoption and implementation at the end of the day. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on the building part of our topic here. And just highlight a couple of things, and I don't want to come off as a naysayer, just more trying to say, as we think about moving forward, what are some of the things that we need to be anticipating that are going to get in the way of adoption? Because there have been wonderful standards produced, wonderful platforms produced that have gone nowhere because we haven't spent the energy on the adoption that's so critical. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that have been brought up over the morning that I wanted to make sure people are thinking about And I'm speaking mainly from the perspective of somebody who's going to go and implement in the prescribers' systems this kind of platform. So first is SPL. Big fan, love it, have used it directly in a lot of ways. It isn't used by any EHR systems, right? EHR systems use drug knowledge bases produced and licensed by a variety of third parties. Cool. So first translation step, SPL knowledge into drug knowledge bases, because we're not going to see a wholesale revamping of where EHRs get their knowledge bases from. So, and on that theme, the knowledge bases get deployed in two very different ways. One way is as data that healthcare IT systems then operate on. And that's going to require a much heavier lift on the EHR or e-prescribing system vendor side to implement, because that's new functionality. The other way, and this is very common, is that the EHR uses services that are deployed by the knowledge-based vendors, either embedded or remote. But even there, the EHR vendors are going to have to change how they do things, because it's not, it's not in the current workflow. So there's going to be change required, which is okay in any situation. But the other thing is that as we draw these pictures and we say authorities, I get really nervous. And I get really nervous for a couple of reasons. One is clearly the knowledge base is going to have to tell me where to go ask. Who's the authority for this particular drug in this particular setting? Cool. Okay, we got URLs. We know how to do that, right? But as you start sort of crossing that with the challenges around cybersecurity that every healthcare provider and EHR vendors worry about, every time you open a hole in your firewall to communicate with one of those services, you get the guys in black suits very nervous. And there are guys in black suits. They come visit me and tell me I can't open holes in the firewall. It's scary. You also have, even if you get past that hurdle, the performance issue, you have now put on those administrators a very heavy performance burden, which ought to scare the bejeebas out of you if you're one of the folks that are being asked to stand this up. Because I'm going to wait maybe 100 milliseconds, right, for your turnaround. From the time I send that message till I've got the answer, maybe 100 milliseconds. As a non-trivial level of service for folks to maintain. And so we're going to say to folks who have this responsibility, you better make it darn fast or else people aren't going to use it. So just a couple of other points, just because, again, I'm highlighting things. The other thing I heard that was really interesting, and I just haven't heard any conversation related to REMS about, is patient matching just appeared. We're going to send a patient identifier and determine whether the patient is enrolled. Really? Health information exchange, as you mentioned, have been trying to tackle this problem for 2 decades now. And we are still struggling with how to make that work well, to get a sort of comfort level of organizations up and so on. And in particular, in this case, we may be denying on failure to match, a patient beneficial treatment, or, so it's a huge problem that is unsolved today. There is no identifier I can send that tells me who this patient is. Now, there's a lot of not renewed, it's never died down, discussion about national patient identifiers and so on, but it is an unsolved problem that's going to rear its head the first time I send a transaction to an administrator and say, is this patient enrolled? And then the last thing that I want to mention, and I think everybody's aware of this, and there was some comment in the last panel about this, this is one of 1,000 gnats for providers and EHR vendors. What I mean by that is, this is one of those things you go, gosh, this is good to do. Is it the most important thing I have to do today? And the answer is, unfortunately, no. It's not the most important thing on my list today. And EHR vendors are listening and responsive to their clients, but the clients are going, okay, golly, the stuff I asked for 5 years ago still isn't done. The stuff I asked for 3 years ago still isn't done. I might put this on the list, but it's down below all of those things. So I think the lag time. So I think the last note is, I think we need to think about ways to move this forward that don't require these wholesale set of changes, this whole cascade of things to happen, because it's going to take some time, even with good intentions, good effort. It's going to take several years for this stuff to cascade through the process. So thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And we might, if we have time, turn back to you on what some of those early steps that we can make progress on might be. So next, I'll turn it to Kelly.
Okay, great. Kelly Weigel, McKesson Relay Health. Thank you for having the opportunity to spend some time with you this morning. And what I think I'm going to do is I changed up my comments a bit because I think Adam did a very nice job of walking through the work around the telecommunications standard in the REMS today, as well as Roger and Michelle and others. So I think what I'll do is sort of go back 2 steps. One is, it makes me think, a couple of years ago, Adam, you did a presentation on the hierarchy of controls. And I think that's a great context to think about for REM standardization and how we think about the platform. Because when you think about the hierarchy of controls, where we are and where we were historically, like with risk maps and others, was that we had sort of the administrative or manual controls at the base of the hierarchy. And if you work your way up, you can eventually get to engineered controls or automated controls. And I think that's part and parcel of what we're trying to get to. So in other words, if there's not an existing standard, there's not a silver bullet. We all live and work within the most complex, largest healthcare system in the world. There's not going to be a silver bullet. But there are going to be a number of great existing data standards that we can use. So I think that the one thing is that we are finding that we're having great success, obviously, with the NCPDP standard. But I think it's important to understand where it came from. So this came from many, many years of work way back when. You go back to 2005, pre the advent of the start of Medicare Part D and the prescription benefit program. We have a legacy of partnering with CMS and putting together a national program that could actually support the management of patients and their benefits. So think about this. It's a very complicated exchange of data where in Medicare Part D, if most of you may be aware of, you have to understand and manage where that patient's out-of-pocket spend is at any point in time, at any prescription, in any pharmacy across the United States. And to understand how that transaction of data works, you'd have to have that connectivity to CMS and to understand what the eligibility is for that particular beneficiary, also working with the Part D sponsors, as well as with state pharmaceutical assistance programs and others, and to be able to match this data, triangulate data, and be able to understand what that patient supplement payment should be at that moment at point of dispense in sub-seconds, to your point, Mark. It cannot slow the workflow at all, and there must be uptime, must be perfect, as well as the speed and to support commercialization activities. So what I would say is when we built and did the work around the REMS programs that are using and supporting the telecommunications standard, it was not done in a vacuum. It was done off of years of work and proven scalability and pressure-tested activities around the NCPDP standard. Now, what I would say is kind of fast forward then to today, what we're also seeing is that many of the programs that we build, we also have taken a modularized approach so that we can manage the various risk factors that we do have across the various REMS programs. And by doing that, it's also caused us to realize that there are different products out there, obviously in the outpatient or ambulatory setting, that need this type of automated control. So what we've been able to do also now is that, again, you'll see in development now, and it'll become more public here in the very near future, where we're taking that same standard so that any outpatient pharmacy that's communicating with a third-party payer and leveraging the NCPDP standard can participate and adopt and use this same standard to be able to do that in a workflow and automated way. So we are excited about the ability to continue to scale and expand in that way. But at the same time, again, realizing this is at best, sort of what I would call sort of a cornerstone of looking at various standards. It's not the only standard. It's not the only solution. It doesn't solve all the problems. There's many, many complexities across REMS that continue to be challenging for all of us, but we do believe that it's a good start. And what we would also say is it also has been very helpful in measuring burdens. So kind of going back to the points about assessment and what is it you're trying to measure in the programs, that we've also been able to use the standards to give us very pristine and comprehensive measurements around what we're trying to look at as far as compliance and metrics and so on around the REMS programs. So with that, I think that gives a little bit more context to what's been sort of referred to this morning as the model program and how we kind of got there and where we're going and continuing to evolve.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Next, we'll hear from Andy.
This is on. Perfect. So I am delighted about my position on the panel. Many of the things I was about to bring up have already been said. And, you know, that's really great for me because one of the real problems is this patient identity. And some of you know that Congress has, through their appropriations language, basically said that HHS can't really implement a solution in that place. So we really, I want to thank you, Mark, for bringing that up. We are very excited about others who are talking about that. It is absolutely one of the things that will make this process not succeed unless we solve that. So, Mark, it's not going to happen in the next 6 months before the administration changes. Just not going to happen. So the second thing I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about is I'm going to speak sometimes as a doctor and sometimes as an ONC guy. So ONC is really excited about the priorities that the Secretary has outlined, and you're going to, all three of our top priorities align with this work completely. So the first thing that the Secretary said is patients have to have access to the information about them. So that means if they're prescribed a drug that has a REMS associated with it, they need to know what that is. Literally this morning while I was sitting here, I got an email from a government representative at the state level in Illinois asking to meet with me in the next 10 days because black box warnings are not being followed by their prescribers, and what could we do about it? I thought that was interesting given some of the conversation that was going on. In fact, I might reference some of you. But this access to information, I think, is essential. The second thing we've said, and the Secretary has prioritized, is that holders of PHI have to make sure that they are not doing something that we're euphemistically calling, or Congress is euphemistically calling, information blocking. That means that content that's held with this colleague's EHR needs to move to this colleague's EHR seamlessly, without any difficulty, and be consumable, that's one of the ONC techie terms, by each other's EHR in a way that it goes into the workflow. And we can't say workflow enough here. Now I'm putting my doctor hat on. And by the way, I don't want to disappoint anybody. Outside of this room, if you ask any prescriber, doctor, nurse practitioner, physician's assistant what REMS is, they are not going to talk about what we're talking about. They are going to be talking about rapid eye movement because this is not a universally understood problem, solution. If you ask any prescriber, do they believe in medication safety and drug safety, they'll say absolutely yes. But there is a hurdle to overcome that I'm not sure has been fully overcome, except within this room and with others in this space. Getting back to my ONC hat, the third thing that we've said is we want folks who are in the space of doing health IT to adopt federally endorsed standards. So we have two different versions of that. We've built some of our standards into our regulatory process. The 2015 edition of the ONC certification has standards built into it. But anybody in this room who understands the federal regulatory process understands that that is not a particularly good vehicle. So we have a sub-regulatory guidance, which is standards that we identify through a process with a year-long thing before they're endorsed, not all that dissimilar to some of the processes that some of the standards organizations use. And we strongly encourage, which gets me to my last point. Man, I haven't even seen a number yet. You ready for me? Okay, I just haven't been looking. That's one of the problems. You know, if you had a countdown on the thing, that would be looking for a technology solution. Sorry. You know, the ability to move forward with this is going to be dramatically dependent on someone adopting it. Now, if you don't, the ONC standards are completely voluntary. Now, they're not really voluntary because our sister agency, CMS, sort of points to them, and now we have other federal entities pointing to them. But the reality is that there is no you must, there is you could, it would be great, we suggest. And so that is a very, very different space. There's not a federal club, and we already heard that the FDA also doesn't have a club at the individual doctor, patient, pharmacist level. And so if we really want to look towards how we move forward, I heard a lot about CDS. And there are a lot of reasons why CDS is not generalizable. Did I miss, I'm done? Or can I talk a little bit about CDS? Just a little bit? Okay. So one of the challenges with CDS is every institution feels it needs to do it itself. So not an advertisement, but we're working with the National Academy of Medicine, formerly known as the IOM, to try and look to see whether or not there could be a more generalizable version of CDS that would also give folks who implement that some legal protections, which is one of the concerns that individual institutions have with CDS that comes from somewhere else. I'm stopping. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much. We do have about 15 minutes left on this panel, so I am going to turn it over to the group in the room for any questions that you might have. But one question getting back to Mark Overhage's favorite topic of adoption of standards. You did sort of open the door for, we do need to focus on very early steps now that can help move this forward that aren't too disruptive, but really making important improvements. So I want to ask the panel on what your thoughts are on where should the focus be moving forward to move this all forward. This all started with the purpose of the REMS program. We really, the end game here is to improve the safe use of medications that we know have some safety issues. The comment was brought up. There's lots of drugs on the market, but only a few, seemingly a few of those, like 34, whatever, drugs that have REMS associated with them. Well, those are the drugs that are being used and have safety issues with them. So the REMS program is important. We also heard from Katie on the previous session that it's a source of frustration for providers in the hospital settings and in other settings of really understanding how to efficiently, make sure that REMS, that they know which drugs have REMS, what the physicians are supposed to be doing with regard to REMS. So I see, few drugs, but lots of frustration, lots of opportunity to improve safety. So this is an important thing moving forward. What can the next steps be? We heard, there's issues with data, existing standards, maybe better collaboration, maybe more standard. I'm not sure what the answer is, but from your perspectives, what should the next focus be? Mark, do you want to?
I'll start with a few thoughts, and these are poorly formed thoughts. Okay, so, but one of the things that strikes me as I've started over the last couple of years is, REMS has become more visible to me anyway. One is this heavy emphasis on the provider training and so on. Or when I say emphasis, it just seems to be the prominent part of the discussion much of the time. In fact, it's our use case for later today, right? And in some ways, we already have such a thing, right? It's DEA numbers. Because there's certain drugs that we say, guess what? You don't get to prescribe them unless you are at least have a DEA certificate. Now, this is a different level in between there, but one of the things that I often find is that partitioning the problem may be useful to think about. And you could imagine, for example, in the dispensing stage, is this really any different than making sure the doc has a DEA number? Well, guess what? It is, unfortunately, because that's a sort of slower turnover, longer-term process. As I understand it, and there's others in the room much more educated than I am, the pharmacy systems, by and large, you download this big set of data and you check it periodically. Okay, a little different. But still, the principle of that is the place where today the provider's authority to dispense something is sort of focused. So maybe that's a thought. And then on the other side, the part of REMS that are more, and I forget the acronym, ATAS. Thank you. Another acronym I got to use. That where it's more data driven from the patient. So, well, maybe that's where you focus earlier. And one of the things I didn't mention earlier that's I think probably many people in this room know, but perhaps not all, is decision support, to your point, in EHRs is completely separate than what we do for drug-drug interactions and so on. It is like a completely separate set of tooling, completely separate set of engines, and they're not up to the task of doing that level of things. So this notion that sort of we're just going to take the data from these drug-drug interaction vendor data sets and sort of fire it up in EHRs, well, it's not going to work that way. It's going to have to get sort of translated to this whole different set of tooling and engines. So the other thing to think about is, maybe for those things, it's not a service. Maybe it really is driven more like other kinds of clinical decision support where it's more, here's the data you need, because we do that well within EHRs. Now, there's these issues that were just being discussed about adoption and fear of FDA regulation and all kinds of things that keep people from doing it. But you could represent that sort of knowledge because it's not turning over quickly. It's not dependent on this external thing. Maybe that fits easier into the EHR world. So segmentation would be my first strategy.
Okay. Any other panelists that want to?
I'll make a comment
Kelly?
to that. I should probably let Terry or Adams jump in here if they want. But I think your point's well made, Mark, about when you think about the DEA aspect of that. That first of all, that seems just clearly logical. And at the same time, I think that people have put that forward, and yet it's not practical because obviously we know it would take an act of Congress to be able to force the DEA to support and pay for education in that way. And I think that's been an ongoing challenge for the FDA, is that they have to stay in their lanes of regulation of what they can control or have jurisdiction over as opposed to other government bodies. And so I do think that's a part of REMS that makes it really hard as well, is that you have the intersection not only of commercialization and regulated activities, but you also have the intersection of government bodies that don't necessarily work together or have the same mandates or points of view, if you will. So I did want to call that out because I think it's a great point you're making, and many people have called on DEA in that way, but it just seems that is not necessarily a path forward, but it's a great point.
Great. Go ahead.
So I'm going to bring up a slightly different perspective. I'm not quite sure the DEA idea is directly applicable to this because the DEA, for controlled substances, it's a very large segment of prescriptions, whereas we're talking about a very small select. I think it really goes better with the prior authorization concept, where it wouldn't really make sense to have every provider certified for these processes because there's just that. It's very, very small. But, in the ambulatory outpatient world, prior authorization is an understood thing, not very liked very much, but we all understand it, and we have electronic standards to deal with it. And then on the inpatient side, every EHR system handles protocols, and it's just a matter of implementing such a protocol.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and turn it out to the group. I think there's a question up in front. If you could just say your name and ask the question.
Sure. I'm Julia Skapik with the Office of the National Coordinator, and I just wanted to put in a shameless plug. So for the past 2.5 years, ONC and CMS have been developing a standard called the Clinical Quality Framework. It is in FHIR, and it brings together the functionality of decision support and clinical quality measurement. It can be used as a shared service, or it can be used as a hard-coded service, but it allows in a modular way for the clinician only to interact with the patient-level data and evidence-based guidance. It potentially could be an effective way to provide REMS-style clinical decision support. I'm happy to answer questions during the break about it.
Great. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder if you can build in or at least strengthening the mechanism for patients or their family for inputs or comments or even complaints, because if you just rely on a provider, a lot of things is misinformation or misdiagnosis, if you want to call that. So especially in mental ill and behavioral science, that type of field is really very arbitrary. So I just wonder if you want to improve the health care and the effectiveness of the drug or medicines and efficiency of this healthcare industry, would you be able to really emphasize and build in very good strategy to improve those IT industry or services?
Great, thank you. Thank you for the comments. This does bring up an important question, and I think, Kelly, you mentioned the experiences that you saw under the true out-of-pocket, sort of out-of-pocket costs for the Medicare Part D program. One thing that we didn't touch on in this panel a lot is this concept of collaboration. So in this space, in REMS, what, in terms of lessons learned or what you think the best steps forward, like what kinds of partnerships and collaborations can really help move this forward? I'm not sure it directly gets to the question, but it's an important one nonetheless.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a huge challenge around collaboration. I think I kind of go back to Roger's comment around that, business needs really drive this. So I think you have to be very practical about this, even though we're here today because of patient safety, and this is very important regulatory actions that we're trying to support and maintain. There's also a huge commercial realistic aspect of this, and the practice of medicine, and time is money. And so these things are all very real, and so how do you bring that forward? I think that obviously with the experience we had with CMS, that was hugely important for everyone. The pharmacies were motivated. The patients were motivated. The Part D sponsors were motivated. In other words, it was important because, frankly, how else were they going to manage these copay benefits and be able to do the coordination of benefits and to ensure that products were getting paid for in an appropriate way and in real time across millions of patients and thousands of transactions a minute. So I think that in this particular case, it's interesting because when we have clients come to us, manufacturer sponsors, remember, this is a rate-limiting factor for many, many manufacturers trying to bring their drug to market, and these are oftentimes life-saving therapies for patients that are in need, and oftentimes these are unmet needs of patients, and yet we have this confluence of trying to manage safe use. And so a lot of times, we have to try to find a way to get practical access commercially to the marketplace, and so at the end of the day, it is about adoption. It's about the physician deciding in that point in time, do I want to write this drug for this patient? A pharmacy choosing to stock and dispense this particular drug because we think this is a drug that makes sense and we want to have it a part of our, to serve our patients in a holistic way and so on. So I guess what I would say that the cooperation around that really is very practically based as to, at the end of the day, it's every set of stakeholders choosing every time to potentially participate in any particular REMS program or to have access to that product or therapy.
Okay, great, yes, thank you. Lee, one more question?
The previous question was a great segue to my question. I've been thinking about that we don't want to overlook a research agenda, if you will, that I've been thinking about that would promote patient-centered care in terms of REMS. So some of the questions that just came to my mind this morning are, one, do we know if patient education about the REMS process, when that initial conversation occurs, do we know how that further leads to enhanced benefit-risk understanding and hopefully positive outcomes? Another question, what component of REMS is bypassed or ignored most frequently? We heard early this morning that in some cases at the pharmacy level, if a monitoring test has been required to go ahead and dispense, for expediency's sake, they might just overlook the lack of that test having been done, and so then the drug is dispensed anyway. So that certainly doesn't sound very public health friendly. Is there any sort of special training or outreach to caregivers if the patient is not able to make some decisions by themselves? From a broader level, what are best practices of advanced payment model practices for dealing with high-risk meds and enhanced roles of pharmacists? I don't think many of these practices are just relying on medication quality measures related to the Beers criteria. And we just heard great concerns about the lack of interface with clinical decision support and many of the REMS requirements. So I think that from a broader perspective, if we're going to be leaders in the push for value, that we can't lose sight of the broader medication use and practice transformation initiatives that are going on, and we want to make sure that, that REMS indeed contributes to these broader goals. But this has been a great session. Thank you so much, Mark and Greg.
Great, thank you, Lee. That's an important point. There are lots of important initiatives that are moving forward to help improve the safety and quality and value of healthcare. And to your point, I think not thinking about REMS as a separate one-off that we need to pull attention away from something else to focus on that, but efforts to sort of bring improvements to the REMS program, like through the Common REMS platform, into existing initiatives that are really getting toward better, higher quality, safer care is an important aspect. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists on this session today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark for our closing comments. Thank you.
You all can stay seated for the moment. You've got to listen to me either way, so may as well stay seated up here. That's right. Well, I want to thank our panelists from this session, our panelists from the previous session, other speakers this morning, especially all of you who are in attendance here in person and online for participating in this effort. I think Adam and Terry both mentioned at the outset that they were very impressed to see this level of engagement, this breadth of engagement around the REMS Common Platform development. I think that highlights the opportunities here, as Greg and others were just saying, to use this effort to achieve some very important overall goals in improving the safe and effective use of medications. We heard today a number of examples of potential use cases where the Common Platform could help. This also, along with your interest, provides a strong foundation and some important momentum for further progress on the Common Platform. We talked about also a strong foundation around technical standards. We talked about NCPDP being a great foundation, at least for outpatient pharmacy-based REMS programs. We talked about HL7 opportunities with the new fire standards. We talked about some challenges on the inpatient side, challenges around linking patient information across settings, challenges around getting consensus on what information really needed to flow to support the REMS. As Mark said, it is more complicated in some ways than things like opiate and controlled substance prescribing. But despite these challenges, there is also a lot of interest in ways to move forward nonetheless, and that's something that I think will be incorporated in the further work that will be undertaken for this effort. Besides the focus on technical standards, a lot of attention today to finding ways to create a strong business case or a financial return on investment on the use cases for the REMS Common Platform that are being developed. Ways to use it to address some of the burdens and other safe use issues that are involved in REMS today, but also ways to use the Common Platform to make REMS a more integral part of quality improvement and decision support activities and more efficient workflows being used by health systems as they progress on a journey to delivering higher value care. There still are a lot of difficult issues to work through here. We heard about some of those challenges in creating effective use cases and getting attention to REMS in the context of all of the other challenges facing reforms in healthcare delivery today. But it does sound like there is a very strong foundation for moving forward. There will be some next steps from this, as Adam noted this morning. This is a collaborative process that will depend on work among many different groups, stakeholder groups, on developing use cases that can be the support for business cases for a REMS Common platform activities that can contribute to cost reductions and improvements in workflows and improved outcomes. But this has been a very important step to help get to those goals. And implementation may not come within the next 6 months, but as I hear from a lot of the organizations that we work with on these very important issues around innovation, healthcare reform, this is a journey, and important progress happens in some ways incrementally, but it's driven by big ideas like this whole broad notion of making REMS much more about a common platform and much more integrated into these overall goals of improving the safe use of medications. So thanks again to all of you. For those of you who want to follow up from today, the archived webcast from today will soon be available on the Duke Margolis Center website, and we'll also be providing more information on ways of staying connected to the work in this area and related areas on our website and as our social media accounts get set up. I do want to thank a few people in particular for making this event possible. I already noted the esteemed group of speakers who have taken some time to share their perspectives on this important topic with us very efficiently for some insightful discussions this morning. And I also want to thank the FDA staff that played an instrumental role in putting this workshop together and more broadly on this collaborative approach to more effective use of REMS. That includes Adam Creet, Aaron Sherman, Megan Moncour, Gita Tosarkani, Steve Berman, as well as the staff from the Office of National Coordinator, Tricia Lee Wilkins, Mara Choi, Julia Skopik. Your insights and contributions to this effort were very valuable. And finally, thanks to our team at Duke Margolis, Greg Daniel, Adam Atten, Elizabeth Richardson, Katie Green, Serena Coates, Joanna Higginson, and Brittany Wise-Goddard for all of their efforts to put this event together as well. But most of all, thank you all very much for participating today and in this ongoing effort to make the REMS program as effective as possible and can contribute to better outcomes for patients in this country today and in the future. Thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you. And, we'd have to add, too, that the hotel has a quick turnaround on this room, so they've asked us to move along in a timely fashion. I'm sure there's some more discussions that will come out of this, but we could take them out to the hallway. That'd be great. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Yeah, great working with you on this.